In the Viscount's house, everyone sat down because there was going to be a ball, which was hosted by Duke Metellio himself. Madame and her daughter discussed the upcoming holiday. The young lady looked closely at her mother and said with a smile that the Duke was a wonderful gentleman. Madame smiled and said that he, as the most avid bachelor in high society, should interest her. Everyone was excited for the holiday, with the exception of one person, the youngest daughter of the family, Adette Bercy. The young lady sighed heavily, as she did not want to go anywhere at all. She knew that her sister would be better suited for the Duke. Madame said that she was worried about her daughter, since she had not received a single proposal for a long period. Madame looked closely at her daughter and said that she should get married this year. The young lady in turn fell to the ground. Everyone rushed to her with the speed of lightning. Viola, looking at her mother, said that her sister was worried. Adette knew that her sister was just an angel. Madame was shocked. She did not expect this, because she knew that her daughter could miss a great opportunity. A moment later, she actually started coughing very hard. Madame told the assistant to call the doctor and give the young lady some rest. As Madame was leaving, she called her daughter since they were already late. Sasha looked at her sister and asked if she was okay. Lady said she just needed some time to rest alone. The young man was puzzled because he understood that this situation was not pleasant. The young lady in turn quickly took off her exquisite outfit and changed clothes. She hoped that such an outfit would be enough. He looked at the lady closely and said that Madame was still here, and he was worried that they might meet by chance. She said that they need to take a risk. The young man sighed heavily and said that this time he had a bad feeling. She looked at him intently and thanked him with a smile, but still said that if they want to provide for their family, then they have no choice. She smiled and said that she was surprised. This disguise is very convenient. The young lady said with a smile that this time she would definitely get the Duke's consent. This life, her fifth reincarnation. She clearly remembered the past lives of her birth. Her past life seemed like a curse to her, in which she lived for almost 30 years. She sighed heavily, because she knew that fortune always had her back. But in this life, she was born a noblewoman. She thought that she would enjoy a carefree life. But unfortunately, the young lady was unlucky this time too. Approaching the residence, she was furious as the line was very long. The young man told his companion that they would only get to the estate in an hour. The young lady was frozen in place in shock, as she did not expect that she had to wait so long. She felt that the Duke's estate was on the same level as the imperial palace. She wondered how much money a gardener made who did all the work. She froze for a moment as she realized that on the day of the ball, the open garden was a secret meeting place for lovers. She realized that she needed to get back before anyone noticed her. But a moment later, the young lady suddenly ran into someone. She froze in place as she did not understand what had happened. She froze when she realized who she had encountered. The young man smiled and called the Viscount. The young lady was shocked as she realized that the Duke himself was now standing in front of her. Taken aback, she stepped back and accidentally tripped, but a moment later he easily caught her. The Duke looked at her intently and said with a smile that he had saved her. He smiled and greeted the Viscount. The young lady froze in embarrassment, but a moment later, they heard obscene sounds from afar. The Duke accidentally dropped the young lady to the ground, and she fell with a crash. He excitedly asked the Viscount if everything was okay with him. Morris looked closely at the young lady and asked her to slow down a little and not put pressure on herself. She sighed heavily and said that if he didn't do this, he would have more work. He looked at the lady and said that the Duke had rejected her offer. She asked in surprise if he had accepted investment rates lower than theirs. The young man hesitated, not knowing what to answer. The young lady looked intently at the assistant in bewilderment. Morris said the Duke conveyed that he did not need the woman's investor's help. The young lady was furious. She wondered if he had turned down her proposal just because she was a woman. She knew that in this world, women rarely make money. Everyone said that a beautiful woman just needs to get married successfully. The woman had to find herself a husband who would provide a luxurious life. Everyone said that making money is not a woman's job. She was furious and thought that this was simply ridiculous. After some thought, the young lady came up with a brilliant idea. She called her assistant. She said that he should send the investment proposal again to the Duke. He was surprised because they were refused. She said that he should send the proposal on behalf of her maternal uncle, Viscount Tarousseff. Her grandfather had only one daughter after his death. No one could continue the line of the Viscount. She knew that if she were a man, she would have inherited the title. Morris excitedly asked the young lady if her plan would work. Adet said that no matter what happens, they must complete this investment deal. She said that her sister would soon get married, and for Sasha's successful debut, she would need a lot of money. She said that her mother would never allow her sister to marry an ordinary man, and the more substantial her dowry, the better. Adet was shocked because she realized that the life of a noblewoman required much more money than she thought. There were only a few businesses related to the sea in the kingdom. A year ago, the Duke announced his intention to found a company to build huge ships and began to attract investors. The young lady knew that this was a very profitable business, and she needed to get into it. She knew she had to invest in this business by any means necessary. The Duke read the proposal from the Viscount. He was surprised since he had not heard the name given before. The Duke said with a grin that it was very funny, and he needed to meet the Viscount in person. The Duke wrote to the Viscount that he would like to meet in person and discuss the details. The young lady was shocked when she read this letter from the Duke. Morris looked closely at the young lady and asked what they should do. He said that he could not go, because perhaps his face had already been remembered. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she would send a letter to meet him. He looked at her intently and asked if everything would be okay after the meeting. She sighed heavily and said that if it was revealed that the Viscount was a woman, she would again be refused, but if she did not meet, she would again arouse suspicion. On the day of the meeting with the Duke, Morris froze in surprise and called out to the young lady. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this was the only way out. He shouted to her that it was dangerous because she could get caught. She said that she had already gone out in this way before, and no one noticed that she was a woman. He quickly realized she was right, but a moment later, he shouted that that wasn't the problem. He shouted that the Duke is perceptive, and he is not a fool like the others. She wondered what she should do in this situation. She looked at her assistant and told him the current situation. He asked for forgiveness for not being able to find a replacement person. She smiled and asked if there was a worthy person who could help her in this situation. He sighed heavily and asked her to be careful, as the Duke might reach for his sword. She smiled and asked what he was talking about. He shouted that she should be on alert. She smiled and said that if the Duke kills her, then he should take care of her family. The young man was shocked. The king of the state is very old, and for this reason, the crown prince is in charge of state affairs. And his brother, without being personally present, led the army to victory and strengthened his position politically. A young lady entered the estate and examined it closely. She knew that the knight who contributed the most to the victory was Duke Bungelisker Cade Metellio. The young lady entered the room and looked intently at the Duke. He greeted her with a smile. She smiled and said that she was honored to be here. She introduced herself by the name of Viscount Tarusov. The Duke looked at her intently after shaking hands. He said that he had not heard of the Viscount before. She said it was all because their family was on the verge of collapse. The Duke asked where they got so much money. She said that it was left from her cousin's deceased husband. The Duke smiled and asked the Viscount if he knew her sister. She became nervous. The young lady froze in place and wondered if he knew about their family. She knew that if he lied, things would become more complicated. Adet sighed heavily and said that her sister's name was Viscountess Berce. The Duke said with a grin that he knew about her family. The young lady froze in place in surprise. She did not know what to answer. He smiled and said that the Viscountess was a beautiful woman, and all her daughters were beautiful, and they said that the eldest was very smart. He said that the eldest was not as beautiful as her younger sisters, but they said that she was quite smart. She was shocked because he knew about her. She smiled and said that she had not seen her nieces for a long time. She noticed that the Duke was very interested in them. He smiled and said that he would like to meet the young lady one day. She froze in place, not knowing what to answer. Looking at the Duke, she said that even if a girl is a genius, she is still a woman. She said that since ancient times, a woman just needs to get married using her beauty. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he thought differently. And although the Viscount's family does not have a man, the eldest daughter manages quite well. He smiled and said with a grin that he was very interested. In this world, everyone liked beautiful women more than smart women. From a young age, it was natural that her younger sisters received more attention than her. The Duke greatly surprised her with his words. The Duke asked if there was a reason why the Viscount wanted to invest in their business. The Duke asked if it was all because of Lady Burse. Adette was taken aback and screamed that it was not so. She knew that she needed to quickly get her act together and make this investment a reality. She looked closely at the Duke and said that she believed in the value of maritime shipping. She said that their country has achieved significant growth on the continent, so a new era will undoubtedly begin soon. She said that at times like these large and reliable ships are needed most. She looked closely at the Duke and said that she would like to invest in the Duke's business and build an iterative of ships. He asked if she really wouldn't have invested if it weren't his business. He wondered why that was, since she loved the sea so much. She said that building ships is difficult, and ships require time and money, as well as advanced technology. She looked at the Duke and said that this is not something that everyone can do. The Duke smiled and said that this was very interesting, since he had not met a person like the Viscount for a long time. The young lady wondered if this was a compliment. She looked at him closely and thought that the rumors were definitely true. Since the Duke was beautiful, she asked if she could ask him something. He said that she could ask, but he would decide whether to answer or not. She asked why he attracts investors if he can handle everything himself. He looked closely at the young lady and said that this project was a state project. She looked at him in bewilderment. A moment later, she realized what she was talking about, that building ships was an attractive business. But since it could become a weapon against the royal family, if the Duke continues alone, he may face scrutiny from the royal family. She said that she understood everything. The Duke smiled and told the Viscount that he grasped everything on the fly. The Duke smiled and told the Viscount that if he didn't mind, he would like to meet again. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke smiled and said that when it was convenient for the Viscount, they could hunt together. She was shocked as she did not want this. The young lady froze in surprise. She did not understand why the stake was so huge. She was puzzled, as she had been spending time with the Duke. The young lady wanted him to stop looking at her so closely. Adette was shocked and told herself that she would never cross-dress again. Contrary to the wishes of the young lady, an invitation came from the Duke. Adette was puzzled and did not know when the conversation about investments would begin. The Duke looked closely at the Viscount and said that it seemed that hunting was too boring for him. She said that it was not so. The Duke told the Viscount that he would like to visit his homeland. Since he had not seen the sea for a long time, the young lady looked away and did not answer. She stared at the Duke and wondered why he was giving her puppy dog eyes. She sighed heavily and said that he could come to her at any time. She mentally begged him to stop behaving like that. The Duke smiled and said that since the Viscount invited him, he should come. She was shocked because she did not want him to come. A moment later, the Duke pulled the young lady back, and she froze in shock in his arms. He looked sideways at the young lady and said that she should be quiet. She froze in surprise, and a moment later saw birds in the distance. She looked closely at the Duke, who was looking at the prey with a playful smile. A moment later, a shot was heard, but the young lady did not take her eyes off the Duke. The Duke looked closely at the Viscount and said with a smile that he had hit the mark. She said nothing, only looked away from him. A few minutes later, his companions ran up to the Duke. The young lady was embarrassed because she was very surprised. She thought that only he knew how to laugh like that. The Duke looked sideways at the Viscount and said that he was riding a horse much better than he thought. The young lady looked at the Duke with a smile and thanked him. The Duke froze in surprise, but a moment later, he himself smiled. The Duke told the Viscount that his domain was near the sea, and therefore he should know the sea well. She said that she could not say that she knew it well. She said that when she thought about what the sea understood, it became unfamiliar. The Duke smiled and said that the Viscount knew much more about the sea than he did. She knew it was natural, since she had been a diver in her previous life. She called the Duke and asked if there were many investors. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he was having so much fun that he forgot what they were going to talk about. The young lady was furious. He smiled and said that the investment was normal. He said that the investment in the Viscount is too large, and it is desirable that the number of investors exceed the amount invested. She was confused and didn't understand what he was talking about. She wondered if he was still wondering how she got the money. He said that, in fact, he had already completed the recruitment of investors. She asked in surprise what he was talking about. She did not understand why they needed to meet. He smiled and said that at first he was interested to hear that a family he had never heard of wanted to invest a huge amount of money. He smiled and said that he then thought he would be fun and wanted to continue talking. The lady was furious. He looked closely at the Viscount and said that it seemed he had made a mistake. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he should have said this from the very beginning. The lady said that she needed to return home, since she no longer had a reason to stay in the capital. The Duke was in shock. He called the Viscount, but it was all in vain. The Duke shouted that he really hoped that they would meet again. She was furious since he had no intention of cooperating with her. The young lady froze in surprise, as she did not understand what was happening. She was surprised because she received an invitation from the Duke. He wanted to discuss the issue of investments again. The Duke wrote that he would like to meet the Viscount and apologize, and if he had not left, then they could meet at the ball. She also received an invitation in her name to the ball. Morris looked closely at the young lady and asked what she intended to do. She was furious and did not know what to do. When the investment plan she worked so hard on failed, she immediately left the Duke, but she was very surprised when she received a letter saying that the Duke wanted her to attend the ball. She knew that to some extent it could be said that it was fate. He looked closely at the Viscount and asked with a smile if he was all right. She said that everything was fine with her, but she knew that contacting him would only cause her problems. The Duke asked the Viscount in surprise why he had come to the garden. She said that she was bored in the carriage, and so she decided to take a walk. He looked intently at the young lady, without taking his eyes off her. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand why he was looking at her so intently. She wondered if he thought she was on a secret date. She was in shock, wondering who she could possibly have met. She thought that it was probably much more suspicious that the Duke was here at such an interesting time. He looked closely at the Viscount and said that he was looking for a blonde man. He asked if he had seen him. She said that she had not seen anyone like him. She saw that he was creating a smokescreen in case of a scandal over a meeting with a woman. He smiled and said that they could meet a little later at the holiday. She slowly entered the hall and heard how everyone admired the holiday. Everyone admired the wonderful holiday, which was organized even without the hostess of the house. Madame looked intently at all the guests present and said with a smile that she really hoped that they liked everything. The Countess said that since there was no mistress in the house now, she helped a little with the holiday. Everyone praised her. The ladies were discussing who the Duke would dance with today. The Countess smiled and said that she was also interested in who he would dance his first dance with. The young lady wondered if they knew about the Duke's arrogance. She knew that the lady who would become the Duchess would not have it easy. A moment later, she heard someone calling Lady Burse. She froze in surprise. Turning around, she saw her beautiful sister in the crowd of young people. She froze in surprise as she thought that someone had called her. All the ladies said that Viola was very beautiful, and many people were courting her, and they were wondering who she would marry. The young lady looked sideways at everyone present. She heard them discussing that the Duke often dances with Viola. They asked the Viscountess if the Duke had really organized a ball for the young lady. They said that the young lady was very beautiful, and the Duke simply could not help but fall in love with her. Adette was in shock, wondering if the Duke really liked her sister. She wondered if this was the reason he was interested in her investment. Madame looked closely at the Viscountess and asked if Lady Adette had not come today. She said that the wedding of her eldest daughter was most important. The Viscountess thanked the missus for her concern. She said that her daughter was not feeling well, so rest at home. The Viscountess, in turn, turned around in search of her daughter. A moment later, she froze in surprise and looked intently into the distance. The young lady in turn froze as she caught her mother's gaze on her. The Viscountess asked forgiveness from everyone present and hurried to her daughter. The young lady was shocked. She realized that her mother had noticed her and went on the run. A moment later, Madame ran into the Duke and was taken aback. The Duke looked closely at Madame and with a smile asked if she would mind if he danced with her daughter. A moment later, the Duke and the young lady walked out into the middle of the hall. Everyone watched the beautiful couple intently while they danced around. The young lady in turn ran out onto the terrace with lightning speed. She exhaled heavily as she realized that she had almost been caught. She knew that if she stayed here any longer, her heart would stop. A moment later, The young lady turned around because she heard someone whispering. She heard that they were discussing her sister. The young people were surprised because they knew that the Duke called her by name. They were furious because they realized that he was trying to hit on her. The young man looked at the young lady with a grin. He did not believe that the Duke would marry her. The young lady, in turn, was furious as she knew that the young man had already crossed the line. She knew that her sister was much more valuable than the Duke. The young lady froze in surprise when she saw her sister dancing with the Duke. She froze in place when she saw the Duke and her sister looking at each other warmly. She was shocked and wondered if the Duke of the Guardian was really interested in her sister. She did not know what would happen to her in that case. She stood quietly on the sidelines while everyone discussed the Duke and his companion. A moment later, the Duke saw the young lady and gestured that they needed to talk. She looked at the Duke puzzled and didn't even move from her place. The man quietly approached the young lady and said that the Duke was calling the Viscount to talk. Madame looked intently at the Duke, who was leaving with the Viscount. She looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he really accepted her investment. The Duke smiled and said that everything was true, but there were a couple of conditions. He told the Viscount that he should sell him the territory of Owl. You should rent it out for a long time. He said that the Viscount could sell the estate to him, or it would take a long time to provide it. The Viscount said that he understood, since the Duke wanted to organize a shipping company in that place. The young lady looked closely at the Duke and said with a smile that this was a great idea. They drank champagne for a great deal. The young lady was glad, because she knew that the hard time was over. The Duke looked intently at the Viscount and wished him a good journey. But a moment later, he asked for 1 minute. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he would like to see her in a dress next time. At the same time, he called her the eldest daughter of Viscount Burse. The young lady was shocked. The satisfied Duke returned to the estate, while the young lady screamed indignantly in the carriage. He smiled and said that the young lady was to blame for this. He knew that no matter how important it was, she actually came and disguised herself as a man. He was surprised when he saw the given amount that she wanted to invest. The butler said that after doing some research, he found out that the Viscount was related to the Beers family. The Duke knew that this family were nobles without pride, since the family made money using resources from their land. The Duke thought that this letter was sent by the Baron's son in order to invest. The butler said that he learned that the Viscount had only one daughter, the current Viscountess Burse. The Duke was surprised that the eldest daughter, without any fear, used this name. He realized that she was problematic. The Viscount was bad at investing and running a business, but his eldest daughter was very different. The Duke was surprised because he could not think that she would come to him dressed as a man. When he inquired again about their family, he found out a lot of what he wanted. The lady had an amazing naive side. Adette was shocked because she realized that the Duke knew that she was a girl. Morris excitedly asked the lady if everything was okay with investing. Adette wondered since when he knew she was a woman. The young lady was in shock and simply could not believe everything that was happening. Madame looked at her daughter and asked if she was okay there, as she had heard screams from her room the previous night. The young lady asked her mother for forgiveness, as she was not feeling well last night, but she is fine now. Madame smiled and said that it was clear that she was working hard for the benefit of their family. She smiled and said that thanks to the young lady, they could live a luxurious life. Madame said, with a soft smile, that she did not need to put much pressure on herself. The young lady looked at her mother, with tears in her eyes, as she was pleased to be taken care of. She knew that if her mother found out that she had dressed as a man, it would be a shock to her. Madame smiled and said that Viola danced yesterday with a stunning young man, with the Duke himself. The young lady said callously that it must have been very nice. Madame smiled and said that lately, the Duke has only danced with her, and everyone is very jealous. The young lady inhaled as she saw everything perfectly with her own eyes. Viola looked closely at her sister and said with a smile that the Duke asked about her. Adette froze in surprise in place. Viola said with a smile that the Duke was interested in her affairs. Madame was surprised that her daughter was dating the Duke. The young lady smiled and said that she met him by chance because of investments. Viola told her sister that the Duke praised her very much, and he said that she was much better than most men in business. The young lady was shocked. She wondered if he was just mocking her. She was unaware of his intentions. Madame told her daughter that there will be many events in the next month. She smiled and said that she would prepare everything necessary. She smiled and said that her sister would soon receive an offer, and they could buy as many outfits as they wanted. Madame looked closely at her daughter and asked if she shouldn't get married this year. The young lady was shocked as she was forced to try on outfits. The Viscountess asked Madame what was in fashion. Now Madame smiled and told about all the new products. The young lady glared at her sister and called out to her. The Viscountess begged Madame to make the Junior League's breasts larger. The Viscountess wanted Madame to add more elaborate ribbon decorations. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that in this life she would never get married. Unfortunately for her, when she got married, she died all the time. In all previous lives, when she died young, there was one more thing in common. On her wedding day, according to her plans, she was executed because of the revolution. In the next life, without thinking, she was quickly sold into a concubine. But unfortunately, she died that day due to the invasion of Japanese enemies. In her next life, the day she decided to marry a man whose face she didn't even know, the Korean War broke out, and she died again. A few months into her new life, and she thought she would get married. But in the end, everything turned out as it always does. Unfortunately, she suffered the same fate as in previous lives. She met with an accident. All her previous lives were very short and lonely. She sighed heavily because she just wanted to create her own family. She was furious, did not understand why she was dying, just because she wanted to get married. She screamed with rage that she didn't want marriage. She just wanted to live. She screamed that if this continued, she did not want to be reborn. Moments later, she saw the light. Looking closer, she saw a silhouette. She was very puzzled as the light blinded her. A moment later, she heard a voice telling her that there was a reason why her wishes were not coming true. She was puzzled because it was too loud, and she couldn't hear anything. She was told that it was all because she was planning to get married. She froze in shock in place. Moments later, she realized the true reason why she was dying young. She wondered if it was all because she wanted to get married. The maid looked at Madame in surprise and asked why she was crying, because the Madame was healthy. Madame said that she was very sorry for her daughter. She did not understand how a girl could be born with such a face. Madame was shocked and wondered if her daughter would be able to get married. The young lady was shocked. She wondered how a newly born child could be so ugly. She wondered if God had given her any chance. She knew that everything was not so bad, and thanks to her current situation, she could live happily and not get married. That's exactly what she thought. But from her debut day until today, she remained alone. She knew that she would not marry, and therefore she consoled herself with the fact that she was doing everything right. Madame asked her daughter what she thought about the Viscount. Although they have a small age difference, he is lonely. The young lady was shocked and wondered if there wasn't a big age difference between them. A moment later, Madame stared at her daughter and asked what she thought about Mr. The young lady was shocked. She learned that this was all useless, since even such men would not be interested in her. Madame looked at her daughter and with a smile asked her to wait a little. The young lady knew that soon her mother would give in and everything would be fine. A moment later, she heard some noise. She turned around and saw her sister dancing. All the men said that the young lady was dazzling, and they really wanted to dance with her. A moment later, the young people said that the first daughter of Burs was present at the event today. For some time, they discussed and compared the sisters. The young lady was furious, because the young people did not shine with beauty. She looked into the distance sadly, because for this reason, she hated going to this event. Madame looked closely at her son and called him. The young man greeted the Viscountess with a smile. Madame smiled and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The young lady in turn froze in place with surprise, as she understood that the mother was looking for a husband for her. Madame looked closely at her daughter and called her with a smile. She smiled and said that it was very opportune that her daughter was nearby. Now she called her. The young man froze in shock in place. He looked at her with contempt. A moment later, the young lady came closer to her and introduced herself with a smile. Madame smiled and said that the young lady had high manners. Madame looked at her son and said with a smile that he should ask her to dance on the top of the lady. The young man was in shock, and he saw his friends mocking him on the sidelines. The young lady in turn was furious. She wanted them to stop since she didn't even want to dance. The young man slowly approached the young lady and asked if she wanted to dance. But a moment later, everyone froze in surprise as they saw the Duke. The Duke slowly approached the young lady and, with a radiant smile, asked if she would give him her first dance. Adette froze in place with embarrassment. She was surprised and did not expect this. The Viscountess looked closely at her daughter and said that the Duke extended his hand to her. A moment later, the young lady finally agreed to dance with the Duke. Everyone stared at them for a while. He smiled and said that she was not only good at riding horses, but also at dancing. He called with a smile her still. But a moment later, he addressed her like a lady. The young lady sighed heavily and said that he seemed to have strange hobbies. She looked at him and said that she would have preferred it if he had told her this from the very beginning. He just laughed. He said with a smile that he would never have imagined that a young lady from a noble family would appear like this. The young lady, in turn, froze in embarrassment when the Duke picked her up. Everyone looked intently and with admiration at the young people who danced for their own pleasure. She was shocked because she realized that the Duke was performing a dance that he only dances at the debut. She sighed heavily and said that she had no other way since he refused her investment due to the fact that she was a woman. He smiled and said that it seemed that there was a misunderstanding between them since he refused because of the business in which she was engaged. He said that he is a knight and his duty is to protect his homeland, and he sheds blood and stands guard over the land. Looking at the young lady, he said that the act of simply buying and selling them did not look good to him. The Duke said that during the first meeting, he tried to humiliate and drive her away. He smiled and said that during their dialogue, contrary to his expectations, she appeared as a completely different person. He said with a playful smile that he really enjoyed spending time with her, so much so that he wants to become her friend. The young lady froze in place in surprise. She did not expect to hear such a thing. He smiled and asked if she would like to dance with him again. The young lady looked at the Duke in confusion and surprise and asked what he was talking about. The young lady wondered in surprise whether he didn't know that only lovers did this. She was shocked because even at none of her birthdays had she attracted as much attention as she did now. Viola told her sister, with a joyful smile, that everyone was interested in knowing about her relationship with the Duke. The young lady smiled and said that they were just talking about business. She smiled and asked if they were talking about investing in a shipping company. She was glad that everything worked out for her sister. She wondered if she had discussed the matter with her sister earlier. A moment later, the sisters gazed into the distance. The Crown Princess's maid, the young Countess Reina Huboden, approached the sisters with a smile. She stared at the sisters for a while without saying a word. A moment later, the young Countess looked at the young lady with a grin. Adette froze in surprise and wondered if the young lady was laughing now. The Countess smiled and told the young lady that she was even more beautiful up close. She said that there were rumors about her engagement to the Duke. She looked at the young lady with a grin and said that he had danced twice with the one who was her older sister. The young lady froze for a moment in surprise, as she realized that now it was not surprising that the Countess had approached them. The Countess looked at Viola with a smile and asked if the Duke was courting her, or if it was all just rumors. Viola looked closely at the Countess and said with a smile that she was not sure whether she should answer this question. The Countess looked at the young lady with fury, as she did not expect this. A moment later, she said that it seemed that even the Duke had gone crazy over her beauty. She looked at the lady with contempt and said that if she only had one beauty, then he would quickly get bored with her. Adette was shocked, as she did not expect such a reaction after a couple of dances. A moment later, silence reigned in the hall. The young ladies looked intently into the distance. Everyone fell silent and parted to make way for the prince and duke. The young lady was frozen in place in surprise as she saw second Prince Wishat Cainix for the first time. Viola looked at her sister and said with a smile that she saw the prince for the first time. Adette smiled and said that she also saw him for the first time. They noticed that the Duke was next to the Prince. Viola said that he was amazing. The Countess approached them with the speed of lightning. Adette knew that if her sister was with the Duke, their family would become related to the royal family. She knew that if they did, their business would prosper. She knew that she needed to stick with the Duke. The young people slowly approached the lady. The Duke called Lady Bercy. Viola asked permission to introduce herself. The prince smiled and said that the rumors do not lie, and she is a diamond of Soviet society. The Duke smiled and said that the eldest daughter of the family was also present. The young lady smiled and introduced herself. She said that she was the eldest daughter of the family, and her name was Adette. The prince looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she was the pumpkin. The duke froze in place with shock. Everyone present looked at the young lady in surprise. The young lady in turn was furious as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The prince smiled and said that he had heard a lot about her from the duke. He said that he had heard that she was very smart, and that is why he wanted to meet her. The duke looked intently at the prince and asked him to step away for a moment. The prince smiled and agreed with him. The duke looked sideways at the young lady, but said nothing. The young lady in turn looked angrily at the duke. She wondered what he had said about her to the prince. The duke asked the prince if this was what he really wanted to say when he asked to meet the lady. The prince smiled and, looking at the duke, asked if he had not said that about her himself. He said that he simply meant that she had pumpkin-colored eyes. The prince was surprised since the duke refused to invest because the investors were a woman. The duke said that at the meeting he changed his mind. The prince smiled and asked if she was really as ugly as rumors say. The duke said that she had ordinary pumpkin-colored eyes. The prince smiled and told the duke that he was the kind of man who would never marry. The duke said that he was only speaking on a business matter. He told the prince not to worry, since he had no intention of getting married before. The prince sighed heavily and said that if this was so, then he was very glad. The prince looked at the duke with a smile and said that he really hoped that he would not change. Sasha looked at her sister with a smile and asked if it was true that she had danced with their duke several times. The young lady smiled, looking at her sister. She said it was nothing special. Sasha said it meant the duke wanted to get closer to her. She smiled and, looking at her sister, asked if she really wanted to say something about this. She asked about it. Sasha hesitated, not knowing how to answer this question. But a moment later, she cried out that she would like to go to Lenocia. Adette asked if she really wanted to go to Lenocia's magic school. Sasha said that she had a friend who went to magic school. Sasha said with a smile that he told her that he also had a talent for magic. Adette said that her mother would be against it. Sasha shouted to her sister that she was a girl herself, but their whole family depended on her. She shouted that she wanted to become not a good wife and mother, but a real magician. Adette sighed heavily and said that even their mother would agree it would still be difficult for her to get there, since in order to enter the school, she needed to have a recommendation from a person with the title of Marquise or higher. Adette said that she really wants to help her sister, but it will be hard. Sasha told her sister with a smile that that's why she started talking about it. Sasha asked her sister with a smile if she could ask the duke for a letter of recommendation. Since she was so friendly with him, Adette was shocked by what she heard. She immediately remembered his arrogant smirk with which he said that she was Lady Pumpkin. Adette was in shock and knew she just couldn't do it. A moment later, the butler entered their office and told the young lady that a guest had come to see her. The young lady was surprised, since she had not invited anyone. She knew that her mother and sister were not at home. The butler said that His Excellency the Duke had come to see the young lady. The young lady was shocked as she did not expect this. Sasha in turn was very happy that the Duke himself came to them. The young lady looked closely at the Duke and said that he had suddenly come to visit them. The Duke smiled and asked for forgiveness for his bad manners. The lady was shocked because she understood perfectly well that he himself knew that it was impolite, but for some reason he came unexpectedly, and without even telling him, the Duke asked the young lady where the other family members were. She smiled and said that her mother and my sister left. She looked closely at the Duke and wondered if he had really come to meet her sister. She said that she was thinking about her coming back in the evening. The Duke smiled and said that everything was fine, since today he came to see her in person. The young lady looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. The Duke smiled and said that her younger sister was very similar to Lady Viola. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was suddenly talking about it. The young lady in turn turned around as she realized that her sister was somewhere nearby. She was in shock when she saw her sister hiding behind the door. The Duke looked intently at the young lady and asked with a smile if she could introduce him to the little lady Bursch Sasha, in turn beamed with happiness. The Duke looked intently at everyone present and said with a smile that the rumors that the young ladies of the beauty family did not lie. Odette was furious since just recently he called her a pumpkin. The Duke looked closely at the young lady with a smile on his face. He smiled and asked if these were the books from the royal library on her shelf. She smiled and said that they are very useful in doing business, and that is why she often visits the library. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it seemed like she really liked to read. Odette arched and said that that's exactly how it was. She remembered being told that reading was a very extravagant hobby for a girl. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she had a very good hobby. He said with a smile that reading is an elegant and wise hobby, which regardless of age and gender, broadens one's horizons and is not subject to scandals. The young lady looked at the Duke with an admiring smile and asked if he really thought so. She smiled and said that she completely agreed with him. She sighed heavily and said that it was a pity that books were very expensive and not so easy to get. She said that if printing made great progress, women from noble families and ordinary people would be able to get easy access to them. She smiled and said that in this case, they too could live a better life. She was puzzled because Togo herself, without noticing, got carried away and began to talk too much. He looked at her closely and said that this was very interesting since she had shown by her example that women could also manage a business well. He said with a smile that it would be very nice if women had more opportunities. Sasha looked closely at the Duke and called him. With burning eyes, she asked the Duke what he thought about teaching the lady magic. Odette was shocked because she did not expect that her sister would ask about something like this. She would like to stop her, but the Duke stopped the young lady, not allowing her to finish, and looking at Sasha, asked for what purpose she was interested. Sasha looked closely at the Duke, and with burning eyes, said that she wanted to become a great magician. The young lady was shocked because she understood that this was a terrible situation. Sasha looked closely at the Duke and asked if he could give her a letter of recommendation to the School of Magic if she was found to have the ability. Odette was shocked and looking at her sister, asked how she could suddenly ask the Duke about such a thing. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he agreed. He smiled and said that if her family agreed, then he could not help but recommend her. He smiled and asked if he could see for himself that the young lady has abilities. He said that he also knows how to use magic a little. A moment later, the young lady decided to show off her abilities to everyone present. He smiled and said that if she could fill the given cup with water, he would recommend her to the school. Everyone present froze in surprise as they noticed that the young lady was still able to summon water. But a moment later, the young lady still could not cope with her ability and accidentally doused the Duke with cold water. The Duke froze in surprise in place. The young ladies looked at the Duke in surprise and dumbfounded as they did not expect this. Quick as lightning, Sasha left the room screaming. Odette, in turn, looked closely at the Duke, since she was very worried that he might get very angry. She froze in place with surprise and embarrassment as she noticed his muscles, which stood out very strongly. After all, his clothes are wet. The Duke sighed heavily and, shaking off drops of water, said that the young lady undoubtedly has talent, and if she wants it, he will certainly write a recommendation. The young lady embarrassedly approached the Duke and, asking for forgiveness, said that he could dry himself with this towel. She was puzzled and did not know what to do with such rudeness. She was puzzled and did not know where to look in this situation. The Duke looked closely at the embarrassed young lady. He slowly walked closer to her and asked if she could forget the rude joke said by His Highness the Prince. She froze in surprise on the spot. The young lady wondered if he was really worried about this. She smiled and said that he would forget about this joke. The Duke looked at her intently and said with a smile that a lot of interesting things happened to her after meeting her. He smiled and asked if she had forgotten the promise she made while pretending to be a viscount. He smiled and said that he would certainly wait for an invitation to Owl. Madame looked at everyone present and said with a smile that the Duke had recently visited their mansion. She smiled and said that she and her daughter were not at home and they could not meet him. Madame said that their eldest daughter received the Duke well. The lady looked at Madame and asked if she knew about the Countess's house party. The lady said that only specially invited ladies and gentlemen go there, and it is a small party lasting only one night. And they said that if even the old miss goes there, she will soon get married. The lady looked closely at Madame and said with a smile that she would try to get her an invitation. Madame looked closely at the lady and said that she did not even know that she was thinking like that about her daughter. Odette was in shock since she knew very well that she would have to suffer again. A moment later, the butlers entered the room and with a smile told Madame that a letter had arrived from the Duke's house. Madame smiled as she was very happy. Madame said with a smile that the Duke really wanted to take a walk with her daughters. The Duke turned around because he heard someone calling him. He froze in place because he saw the princess. Crown Princess Alcana, Elvonge, looked at those present with a smile and told the Duke that they had not seen each other for a long time since he had not appeared in the palace. The Duke greeted the princess. The princess smiled and told the Duke that he looked good. She looked closely at the Duke and said with a smile that she saw the rumors she was not deceived. The Duke looked at the princess in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The princess smiled and said that she was talking about how he was going to get engaged to an exorbitant beauty. She said that everyone was taking great interest in his marriage. The Duke smiled and told the princess that he did not know that she was also taking great interest in it. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he spoke as if he regretted it. She looked at the Duke with a grin and asked if his chosen one could not become her friend. The Duke thought sadly about what the princess said. He wondered if they could still call themselves friends. The princess smiled and said that young ladies shed a sea of tears, and even her maid the countess was very upset when she heard these rumors. The Duke looked sideways at the prince and said that he was much more famous than him. The prince smiled and looking at the princess said that he knew that she came exclusively to the Duke. For this reason she did not even notice him. He fixed his furious gaze on the princess. She looked at him intently and said that he should also find a good match to marry. He looked at her in surprise and said that he didn't even know that she supported him about marriage. The princess looked closely at the prince and with a smirk asked what he was talking about. She said that she just hoped that he would meet a lady from the right family. The prince looked at her intently and asked who was really interfering with his marriage. The princess did not answer, and with the speed of lightning, she left their company. The prince looked at the Duke with a smile and asked if it was true that he was more popular than the Duke. He smiled and said with satisfaction that his appearance was more outstanding. The Duke sighed heavily. He wondered if he should just hit the prince. Returning to the office, the prince asked the Duke what about the letters he was interested in, whether he had returned them all. The Duke sighed heavily and said that they had not returned yet. The prince said that they undoubtedly needed to find them faster than the crown prince did, princess. He said with a grin that she started moving people there. He said with a grin that her game of dolls will soon come to an end. The young lady looked intently at everyone present, and with a satisfied smile said that she really liked it here. Since Lenocia was very close, Odette looked closely at her sister, and with a smile told the Duke that she was still a child, and he should understand her. The Duke said with a smile that if they had some time, it would be nice to visit Lenocia for a while. The young lady said with a smile that if they came too late, then mother would worry. She was puzzled because she knew that they were already gone far enough. Cade smiled and said that everything is in order, since Madame herself said that they might come back late. Madame smiled, and I, looking at my daughter, said that today they can stay as long as they like, since they may need a lot of time for conversations. She was puzzled, as she knew that her mother already had a plan planned. Sasha screamed with a smile as she noticed a boat nearby. Odette was puzzled, as she knew that it was not surprising, and they had taken too much stuff for a normal walk. Sasha looked closely at her older sister and asked if she wanted to go boating. The young lady said with a smile that she didn't want to do that. Sasha became very sad, and looking at her sister, she said that she would like to go on a boat ride. The young lady looked closely at her little sister and said with a smile that they didn't come for fun today. She smiled and said that they could ride next time. Sasha was shocked and didn't understand why the young people were riding then, but they don't. The young lady looked intently into the distance and asked with a smile if they were not suitable for each other. Sasha looked at her sister in surprise and asked if the Duke and Viola really liked each other. Odette looked at the young people with a smile but did not answer. She looked at them intently and wondered if her sister would be happy if she married the Duke. She was looking forward to the wedding of her younger sisters, but in turn, she was well aware that she was a completely different matter, as her life would come the end if suddenly she gets married. She sighed heavily as she understood where this emptiness came from. The young lady looked intently at her assistant and said that she already needed to start preparing the dowry. He looked at her in surprise, but did not answer. She sighed heavily and said that her sister would soon receive a marriage proposal. The young lady said that it was a great honor for their family. The young man, in turn, looked sadly at the young lady, but did not answer. The Duke looked intently at everyone present and said with a smile that too much time has passed, and if they want to go to Lenocia, they need to go right now. Sasha agreed with the Duke with a smile. Adette told her assistant that upon arrival, she needed to give an invitation to the Duke. For this reason, it was necessary to decorate the residence. Morris looked at her closely and agreed. Adette said that the eagle owl does not collect many taxes. She was surprised and wondered what people in this territory do for a living. Morris said that the land is depleted, and reclamation is difficult since there are few people living in this territory. For this reason, most of the residents are engaged in fishing. She knew that the category of fish and seafood is not included in the goods. Taxable. She knew that in this case it is not surprising. The young lady looked closely at her assistant and said with a smile that she would borrow the tax code upon her return. Viola accidentally yawned and asked for forgiveness from her sister Adette. With a smile, asked for forgiveness from her sister, since they had gone so far, and she started talking about work again. She looked closely at her sister and said that Sasha would be late. She asked her sister if she wanted to go out and look around. Viola smiled and said that she was very tired, so she would rest in the carriage. Adette looked closely at her assistant and asked with a smile if he wanted to go for a walk. He hesitated, but a moment later he said that he needed to take care of business, and later he would go. Adette looked at him with a smile and said that she could not do everything without him. She asked to take care of his business. The young lady, in turn, slowly went for a walk in the late evening. A moment later, she hesitated and wondered if she should go back. She froze in surprise as she felt someone's presence behind her. She looked at the young man in surprise and, in turn, wondered if it was really a local magician in front of her now. She froze in shock and could not move as she felt his destructive aura. She was shocked and realized that he was very dangerous. The young lady, in turn, ran with the speed of lightning. She was puzzled and wondered why again this time she had to die. This time she did not even dream of getting married. She was puzzled as she did not want to die so early. The young lady screamed as she realized that someone had touched her. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise. She in turn looked at him, in fear, with tears in her eyes. He froze in alarm, looking at the young lady. A moment later, he asked what was the matter. Sasha screamed and called her sister. The young lady looked intently at everyone present and calmly said that an outsider had invaded them. The Duke was shocked as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was hurt. Adette sighed and said that she was fine. The Duke looked intently at Miura and hastily said that they already need to go. She looked intently at the Duke and asked him to take care of himself. The young lady sighed heavily and, looking after them, quietly muttered that this was already the 5th time. She looked closely at Adette with a slight grin and said that the young lady is a very interesting person. Adette froze in surprise in place, but did not answer. The Duke looked sideways at the young lady and asked in bewilderment what Muri was talking about. Muri bowed her head in front of the young lady with a smile and said that this time she must definitely achieve what they want. Adette walked back home with everyone, but she couldn't get everything that had happened out of her head. She wondered if the young lady had really seen the life she had lived before. It was stuck in her head that she had to achieve that what he wants. She sighed heavily because she understood that she would already be glad if she were not dying a quick death. She froze in surprise as she noticed that the Duke was looking at her. She looked at the Duke in surprise and wondered if she had imagined it, and he was looking at her intently. The Duke looked intently out the window and said with a gentle smile that the moon was very beautiful. Adette, in turn, looked out of the window embarrassedly and said with a smile that he was right and she was very beautiful. After the Duke's walk with the young Viscountesses of Bears, rumors of an engagement to Viola spread even faster. In order to find out the feelings of the Duke-Countess, Daisy invited 3 people to the party. Everyone wanted to know if the lady would get engaged to the Duke. The young lady, in turn, had fun with the Duke. Adette looked closely at her assistant and said that she was right. Everything that the sea brings is not included in the list of goods subject to tax, and they are mainly engaged in fishing, so the tax collected there is small. If they take advantage of this opportunity, then they can earn a lot of money. The Duke glared at the young lady with a smile on his face, while Morris in turn glared at the Duke. The young lady looked at her assistant in surprise and called him. He was taken aback and answered his mistress with the speed of lightning. A moment later, he said that they could visit this land now, and it would be nice to take a look at the newly annexed lands. The young lady sighed heavily and said that that was right. She glanced sideways at the Duke and her sister, who were having fun. A moment later, she looked at the young lady. She was to some extent the same as before. A moment later, a young man approached the young lady and greeted her with a smile. Adette looked at the young man in surprise. After dancing with the Duke, ordinary men began to greet her first. The Duke looked intently at the young lady, who was approached by a young man a few minutes ago. A moment later, the Duke sauntered up to the young lady and said that she even worked here. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise, because she did not understand why he approached her. She looked at him intently and said that he wanted to visit this area as soon as possible, so she needed to work hard. Adette knew that he was just constantly rushing her, which caused a lot of work to fall on her. Viola looked at the Duke closely and said with a smile that he should understand her sister. She said that her sisters had a lot of work, so she didn't even want to come, but their mother forced her to go to this event. The young man with the speed of lightning switched to the young lady. Adette froze in place, amazed by the spectacle. Viola looked closely at the young man, and with a smile asked if she had accidentally interrupted his conversation with his sister. The young man smiled and said that this was not so. The Duke sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, he too was forcibly dragged to this holiday. Madame looked closely at the Duke and said with a smile that it seemed like he didn't want to come, but still in the end he was here. She said that he would never marry, so she had no choice but forcefully drag him to the holiday. He looked closely at his aunt and said with a smile that he would like to introduce the young ladies to her. He looked closely at the young ladies and said with a smile that he would like to introduce them to his godmother, the Countess. He smiled and said that she was also the organizer of this party. The young ladies thanked the Countess in unison for the invitation. The Countess gazed at the young ladies with a smile on her face, as she knew that they were the ones in whom the Duke was showing interest. Viola looked closely at the Countess and introduced herself with a smile. The Countess looked at her intently as she realized that it was she, the Duke's chosen one. Adette, in turn, also introduced herself. The Countess looked intently at the young lady. A moment later, she realized that the lady was the same aristocrat whom she had seen earlier at the ball. Madame looked closely at the Duke and said with a smile that she was very happy, but her preferences had changed again, so she was thinking of postponing his wedding. The Duke looked at his aunt in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked intently at the ladies present and asked if she should tell them the special reason for opening this party. She smiled and said that here and now it is not the parents, but they themselves can choose a couple for themselves. Madame said that upon returning to the room after the end of the party, they should take the silver candlestick, which stands in the hall, and they should wait for the man they liked, and the lady they liked should light the candle. This is a promise to go on a date tomorrow morning. She looked at everyone present and said with a smile that she really hoped that they would meet their true couple here. The young lady was in shock. She did not want to meet anyone even under the threat of death. Viola looked closely at her sister and called her. She asked her sister if she had heard what the Countess said, that the Duke did not want to marry. Adette looked at her sister in surprise and said that this simply cannot be. After all, the Duke fell in love with her. Viola looked at her sister with a smile and asked if she really thought so. Adette looked at her sister and said that, of course, everything was exactly like that. She knew that otherwise the Duke would simply have no reason to show kindness to her. The young lady slowly left her sister with a smile on her face, but a moment later, she froze in place in surprise, as she did not expect to see something like this. The young man looked at her with a smile and said that they would meet tomorrow at the back door in the garden. Adette froze in place. In surprise, she could not utter a word. Viola, on the contrary, was glad to meet. The next day, the young lady was in a hurry. She was in shock and didn't understand where he had gone. She was furious because she had come all this way for one man. But to her regret, she only met a strange man. She was furious because she couldn't even start a conversation with the Duke. She didn't know whose candle he was lit at yesterday. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw the Duke in a hurry. She knew that she simply could not return without finding out anything. The young lady hurried after him. A moment later, she froze in place as she heard someone calling her. Madame looked intently at the young lady and asked with a smile where she was in such a hurry at such an early hour. The young lady was in shock, since of all people she was lucky enough to run into the godmother of the Duke. She hesitated, not knowing what to answer, asked question. Madame looked closely at the young lady, and with a smile said that it was too early for breakfast, and she offered to go have a snack with her. The young lady looked at Madame in surprise and agreed with her, because she knew that she had no choice for a different outcome. The Duke slowly cut a beautiful piece of meat for his companion. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it would be very nice to see her in the morning. The young lady froze in surprise in place. She did not know what to answer. She looked around the area with lightning speed as she could not find her sister. She was puzzled and wondered if it was not her sister who was supposed to come to meet the Duke. The Duke ate slowly. He sighed heavily and said that I wanted to ask her that time. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, there was no opportunity, so he called her separately. The young lady looked at the Duke in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and asked on the day of their walk if she remembered what the stranger who was at the School of Magic looked like. She sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, because of the darkness, she could not see the details, but he definitely had blonde hair that covered half of his face. The Duke froze in place from shock. His face turned pale. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if he had any idea who it could be. Cade sighed heavily and said that he was not sure. She looked closely at the Duke, as she saw that he did not ask anything else. She looked at him intently and wondered if every time he appeared suddenly, he was thus drawing the line. She knew that they were connected only by the fact that he was a candidate for grooms, her younger sister, and that they are business relationships, nothing more, nothing less. She smiled and said that the owl residence was decorated, and she would have it ready when he named a day on which he could visit her. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that it was very good and they could go to this week. A few days later, the young lady visited the Phelan residence. She was glad, because in this outfit she felt most comfortable. She knew that if she continued to dress in this way, she would certainly be scolded. Sometime later, she sat and gazed at the beautiful view of the sea. She realized that this area was very suitable for a shipping company with great depth and a convenient sandy shore. A moment later, she noticed someone was swimming. She noticed that a young girl had come out of the sea, and now she was sure that the girl had not been swimming at all. She was surprised that the young girl was collecting materials and working so hard at such a young age. Adette was slowly preparing to return home. A moment later, the young lady heard someone scream nearby. The man angrily pulled the young girl back. He didn't understand where such a little girl had so much strength. She in turn screamed that she wouldn't give him what she had. Adette was furious. She decided to intervene, as she did not understand what such a big man was doing with a small child. The man got scared, and with the speed of lightning, he pulled the bag back to the little girl and ran. The young lady was furious. She ran up to the girl and asked if she was okay. In turn, the girl began to cry, very much. The lady was in shock as she did not expect this. A moment later, the young man approached the lady and asked if she really had a sense of justice, and she decided to help. He looked closely at the young lady and said that now the little girl in the family has nothing to eat. Adette looked closely at the young man, as he was very handsome. She noticed that he looked like he came from a noble family. She looked at him intently and said that it was very rude towards someone who was trying to help. She felt like he was like the girl's older brother. He looked at her intently and asked if she really thought she helped the girl. He looked closely at the lady and said that because of her actions and the horse, she was scared, and everything was taken away from her. Adette was furious because she only wanted to help. She looked closely at the man and asked if it would be enough for her to replace the lost food. She said that then the girl would not have to work at sea for a while. She was furious because a grown, healthy man was forcing his little sister to work. He looked at her intently and said with a grin that the nobles seemed to think that money solved all problems. He said that even if there were silver coins in this province, it would be difficult to get food with them. He said that because the owner of the territory left the depleted lands unattended, only the local residents are suffering. She said that now new lands have been annexed, so the situation has improved, and the current owner is different from the past in all aspects. He looked at her intently and said that he doubted it, since in his opinion, the nobles of this kingdom are busy making money only for themselves. She knew that the previous owner was addicted to gambling, and as a result, sold these lands at a low price. She understood perfectly well how the residents felt, so she did not want to be considered the same. Her lady shouted at her with rage, because she wanted to stop the young people. She looked intently at the young man and told him to stand still. The young man looked after the young lady in surprise as she dived under the water with the speed of lightning. The girl looked closely at her uncle and asked if everything would be okay. The young man stood quietly and did not say anything to the girl, but a moment later he rushed into the sea. A few minutes later, he saw a young lady emerge gracefully from under the water. The girl was shocked as she noticed the young lady. Adette looked at them with a smile as she was pleased with the catch. The girl ran closer to the young lady with the speed of lightning. The young man looked at her intently. Adette gave the young girl all her catch. The little girl was very happy because she knew that now she had food. The maid was surprised and excited, looked at the mistress, and asked what happened to her. Since she was in men's clothes, she was also all wet. Adette Tello sighed, and looking at the maid, said that she was very tired and asked her to get ready for bathroom. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that a guest had come to her. Adette was surprised, since she was not expecting any guests at all. A moment later, she saw the Duke in all his glory. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and said that she had finally come. He looked at her in surprise, but a moment later he embarrassedly looked away and said that it had not rained, but she was very wet. Adette froze in place with embarrassment as she realized that she was standing in front of him in an ugly form. She sighed heavily and covered herself with the cape. She sheepishly asked him if he wasn't supposed to come in a few days. She was puzzled since he came without even warning her. The Duke sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that unfortunately his schedule was confused. He sent her a letter, but unfortunately he got ahead of the letter itself. She was puzzled since he told her that he did not do it on purpose, but still sent the letter. The young lady in turn was very angry with him since she saw that he did not see any problems in this situation. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that her bath was ready. Adette looked at the maid with joy as she had arrived on time. The Duke looked at the lady and asked where the other family members were. She smiled and said that they should arrive in a few days, and she also said that her sister would be coming. He looked at her closely and said that it seemed that she really wants him to become part of her family. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if there was anyone in their kingdom who did not want to become related to the Duke himself. He looked at her intently, with a smile on his face. She was puzzled, because she didn't understand why he asked such a question, knowing the answer right away. Adette smiled and asked what he thought about horseback riding tomorrow. Hart hesitated and said that he agreed. He didn't understand why she was the first to ask about it. She smiled and said that today she was looking at suitable lands for the shipping company, and tomorrow they could look together. The Duke looked at her intently and agreed with a smile. The maid looked at the young lady puzzled and said that she would be in big trouble if her mother saw her like this. The lady sighed heavily and said that her mother was coming the day after tomorrow. Camilla was worried because she was worried that there might be rumors that the young lady arrived at the residence with a man and they were left alone. Adette, with a smile, said that there was nothing between her and the Duke. She said it was her just a few hours ago. The young lady, with the speed of lightning, lifted the Duke from the bottom and dragged him to the shore. She was in shock and did not understand why he could not swim. In a hurry, she screamed and called for the Duke, as she was very worried. She was in shock, did not understand what a strange situation was now. The young lady slowly approached the Duke because she knew that she had to save him. She knew that she had to give him artificial respiration. A few hours before the incident, they were walking along the seashore. She knew that the sea in this area was deep and suitable for the departure of large ships. There were also cliffs and cliffs, which made this place also suitable for the location of a shipyard. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that this place was the best they had visited today. He asked if this was the land she had recently bought. Adette looked closely at the Duke and said that everything was true. She was surprised and did not understand how he knew about it. The Duke smiled and said that lately more than one or two people have been telling him about the affairs of the bears. Family, Adette, puzzled, said that there are a lot of friendly people around. She looked in surprise at the Duke, who approached the young guys. He looked at them closely and asked with a friendly smile on his face, could he borrow a boat? And in return, he would give them coins. She looked closely at the Duke because she knew that this no use. The young guys looked at him intently and said that they didn't need it. The Duke looked at them in surprise and asked if they didn't know what silver coins were. The guys said that they didn't need them. The young lady slowly approached the young guys and asked with a smile, "How about this?" She provided them with a whole basket of treats. The young people agreed and said that they could take the boat. She looked closely at the Duke and said that food was better for them than money. She was surprised and did not understand why the Duke needed a boat. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he had not been able to go boating near the lakeshore recently. For this reason, he wanted to take her for a ride now. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise. She was embarrassed and amazed, as she did not expect to hear such a thing from him. Some time later, they swam carefree on the sea. The Duke gazed at the young lady, and meanwhile, she looked at the children who were frolicking on the shore. The Duke thought for a moment and said that he would like to rent a boat in a place where he would go out with the young ladies of the Burse family. The butler looked at the Duke in surprise. He thought that the young lady liked boats. He looked closely at the young lady and said that he had heard that she liked the sea, so he thought that she liked to sail on it. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed that he was mistaken. The young lady was taken aback and embarrassedly said that this was not true at all, and she liked everything very much. Just looking at the little children, many thoughts arose in her mind. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was thinking about. She sighed heavily and said that she was now thinking about what one local resident told her. He said that the ruler of these lands neglected this area, which is why the residents have to live very hard. She sighed heavily and said that while she was attending balls in the capital, it was very difficult for them to find a livelihood. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that it was not her fault. What the Baron did was wrong by losing the land data at cards. She thought for a moment and said that the villagers might also think that she was no different from the previous owner. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that this was not so, as they would soon be grateful to her. They will be grateful that such a person as the young lady became the owner of these lands. Adette froze in place with embarrassment. She was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such words from the Duke. He smiled, and looking at her, said that she would not neglect this territory. She had already made a deal with him about the shipping company, and also sacrificed her freedom and dressed like a man. The young lady thanked the Duke with a smile for his comforting words. He smiled and said that this was not consolation at all, but just the pure truth. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if she could propose to him again. He looked at her closely, with a smile on his face, and said that he was listening to her. She smiled and said that this place is suitable for the location of a shipyard, but it is far from the village, so it will be very inconvenient for the workers during construction. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had not thought about this problem yet. She said that she would prepare housing and a dining room for the builders. Looking at the Duke, she asked with a smile what he thought about this. She said that in this case, care must be taken to maintain public order in the city, since there will be more thieves than she thought. He smiled and said that he agreed with her, and upon returning to the capital, he would ask for a garrison. And if things went well, then these lands will soon become very lively. The young lady looked around the area with a smile. She was glad that everything was going so well, but a moment later she froze in place and wondered how far they had sailed from the shore. The Duke said with a smile that it seemed that the sea was helping them. Since they sailed very far, although they did not row, the young lady was shocked because she knew that this was not help at all, but an ebb. When the tide is low and the waves can easily carry a man very far away, the young lady stood up with the speed of lightning, and looking at the Duke said that he needed to hurry back. A moment later, she realized that they had hit a rock. She was in shock as water filled their boat. She knew that it was only a matter of time before the boat sank. She was puzzled because she knew that they had to somehow get to the shore. Adette understood perfectly well that they had a small but chance. She looked at the Duke excitedly and called him. The young lady in a hurry asked if he could swim, but a moment later she froze in shock as she saw the Duke drowning. She screamed and called for him, but it was all in vain. With the speed of lightning, the Duke plunged under the water. The young lady in turn was not at a loss, and with the speed of lightning plunged after him in order to save him. Adette managed to save the Duke with the help of artificial respiration. She looked at him excitedly because she saw that he had already woken up. She was very frightened and hurriedly called the Duke. A moment later, she exhaled heavily because she felt relieved. After he woke up, she said that they were very lucky that there was a desert island nearby. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she really saved him. He looked intently at Adette with a smile on his face and said that if it weren't for her, something irreparable would have happened to him. He sincerely thanked the young lady for saving her, Adette frozen in place. With embarrassment, she was excited and didn't know if they would be saved today. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that when they see the horse at the parking lot, they will definitely start looking for them. He said that they should light a fire because it might help. The Duke, with the speed of lightning, used his magic and lit a fire. The young lady was amazed, as she did not expect to see such a thing. She looked sideways at the Duke because next to him, she felt different than usual. She wondered if it was all because they were stuck on a desert island, just the two of them. She hid her eyes from him. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she seemed to have a fever. She looked at him embarrassedly, as she did not expect this. She looked away from the Duke and said that it was all because of the fire. He smiled and said that it was very good that she was not sick. He sighed heavily and said that she must be very tired and could now sleep peacefully. Adette looked closely at the Duke and agreed with a smile. She was sleeping quietly, but suddenly she heard the Duke calling her. The Duke looked excitedly at the young lady and called her. He said that she should wake up, as it was already starting to rain. Looking at the gathering clouds, the Duke said that there was no point in drying his clothes anymore. Adette froze in surprise when she saw the Duke begin to take off his shirt. He looked closely at the young lady and said that if the body temperature drops, it will be very dangerous in this situation. She was shocked and did not know where to look. She froze in place with embarrassment. The young lady was very worried because he was too close to her. She knew that it was very dangerous and bad for the heart. The Duke looked sideways at the embarrassed young lady. He looked at her intently and said that they needed to stand like this for a while. She froze in place, not knowing what to answer. He sighed heavily and said that lighting a fire and calling for help would not work, and they needed to find another way. A moment later, the young lady looked into the distance, and a brilliant idea came to her. She ran up to the Duke and asked if he could give her his shirt. The Duke looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duke was shocked, as he did not expect this from the young lady. He looked at her intently and asked what she was making. A moment later, the young lady looked at the Duke with a smile and said that she had already done everything he asked in surprise, what it was, since he had not seen anything like it before. She smiled and said that by launching it into the sky, they could call for help. He looked at her skeptically and asked if it would work. She looked closely at the Duke and said with a smile that they should still try. She was puzzled because a lot of time had passed, and she was very tired, but unfortunately, nothing worked for her. The Duke looked at the young lady puzzled and asked her to stop. He said that he would like to try it. Adette, in turn, did not want to give up just like that. She said that she would try one more time. The Duke looked intently at the young lady, who was trying to fly a kite. Adette looked at the Duke with a smile and said that he should look at it since she succeeded. The Duke in turn looked at the young lady with a soft smile. He said that it was true amazing. The Duke slowly approached the young lady with a smile on his face and said that it looked amazing. The young lady slowly walked back and accidentally collided with the Duke. She asked for forgiveness because she did not expect to collide with him. But moments later, she fell into his arms and looked at him in bewilderment. Cade in turn looked at her with a soft smile. He touched her face tenderly and said with a smile that he would take care of it so that she could rest for a while. She froze in surprise and still agreed with him. The young lady watched the Duke closely. She thought he was very hot without a shirt. She looked at his beautiful body from afar and could not take her gaze off him. A moment later, memories from the previous night came flooding back to her. She confusedly wondered if she was going crazy. Adette was in shock and wondered what she was thinking in such a situation. A moment later, the Duke called the young lady, and with a smile said that a boat was heading towards them. The Duke looked intently at the young man and thanked him with a smile for saving them. He asked if the young man usually sailed along such a route. The young man said that he usually did not do this, but this time he saw something in sky and decided to see what it was. The Duke looked at the young lady with a soft smile and thanked her since they were saved, thanks to her. A moment later, the Duke looked back because he heard someone calling him. The knight looked at the Duke excitedly and asked if he was safe. The Duke looked at the knight and said that they came very quickly. The Duke smiled and said that, fortunately, a fisherman found them. He told the knight to give the fisherman 3 gold coins, and they should also buy good clothes for the fisherman. The knight was taken aback looking at the young lady because he saw that she was falling on land. Adette in turn sighed heavily as she realized that she had relaxed too much. She was puzzled and did not understand why she wanted to sleep so badly. A moment later, she collapsed to the ground with a roar. Madame looked at her daughter excitedly and asked what had happened to her. The young lady in turn was lying on the bed with a strong fever. Madame angrily looked at the maid and asked what happened. The maid hesitated in confusion, and a moment later, she said that the young lady got caught in the rain yesterday while walking. That's why it all happened. The young lady in turn asked her maid not to tell Madame what happened to her. Madame sighed heavily and looking at her daughter, said that it seemed that she was very tired when she received the Duke as a guest alone. She told her daughter something, and today, she should just rest and not worry about anything. Writhing from heat and pain, the young lady nevertheless agreed with her mother. Adette slept quietly in bed. Through her sleep, she felt a delicious smell. She heard laughter from the room, and she thought that her family was fine, even without her. She slowly got up from the bed as she felt disappointed that she had just been lying in bed all day. She slowly walked to the window and looked out onto the street. She looked in surprise at the Duke, who was engaged in fencing. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and called out to her in alarm. She screamed and said that the cold wind was contraindicated for her, and with the speed of lightning, she closed the windows. The Duke looked intently in the direction where the noise had just been. The maid looked intently at the young lady and said that she should rest well and get well soon, Camilla. With a smile, the young lady said that then she would be able to dine with the Duke and even ride a horse. Adette. In turn, she knew very well that this would not happen, even if she gets better, because now Viola was nearby. The young lady looked out the window and saw a beautiful picture. Sasha saw her sister with a smile and greeted her. Sasha smiled and said that the Duke taught her to ride a horse. Adette looked at her sister and said with a smile that she did well. The Duke looked at the young lady excitedly and asked if she was feeling well. She smiled and looking at the Duke said that she was much better. He looked at her intently and with a soft smile said that he was very happy about this. She looked at him embarrassed but did not answer. Viola looked closely at the Duke. Adette looked at her sister puzzled as she saw her look. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked if anything had happened to her with the Duke. She smiled and said that there was nothing between them, and if her sister found out, then she might be upset. She asked the maid to make sure that they didn't let it slip at the residence. Sasha looked closely at her sister and said with a smile that they could go together a little later to their shore. The young lady looked at them intently and said that she could not, as she needed to rest a little. She smiled and wished them a good walk. With the speed of lightning, she turned around as she did not want them to see her face. She sighed heavily and thought that, most likely, because of the illness, she had become weaker in spirit. Late in the evening, the young lady went down to the kitchen to drink water. She was puzzled because she knew that when the Duke and her sister got married, she would often see a similar picture. She was very alarmed and did not understand why she did not want this. Adette sighed heavily because she knew it wasn't even funny. The Duke looked at the young lady in bewilderment and called her She in turn looked at him in surprise and called. She did not understand why he was not sleeping at such a late time. Cade sighed heavily and said that unfortunately, sleep did not come to him. He looked at her intently and asked if she was feeling well. Adette looked at Cade and said that everything was fine, and starting tomorrow, they could plan a schedule together. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that it was very late and they needed to get up. He smiled and said that he would take her out. She looked at him intently as she remembered that even at the Countess's party, he did not see her sister off, but saw her offer. She was puzzled and did not understand why he showed kindness to her so often. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that they had already arrived. The Duke smiled and extended his hand to her. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. With a radiant smile, he took her hand and kissed it tenderly while wishing her good night. She stood embarrassed in surprise, as the skin he touched with his lips was burning. She looked at him intently, and in a cold tone wished him good night. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise. She sighed heavily because she thought that she was not completely better. With the speed of lightning, she returned to the room. She was in shock and wondered why she had a fever again. The maid knocked on the young lady's room and asked if she was awake. Adette looked closely at the maid and asked with a smile where her family was. The maid smiled and said that they were all in the living room with the Duke. Looking at the lady, she said that she seemed to have fully recovered. The young lady slowly walked down the stairs. She was in a hurry to see her family. Madame looked closely at the Duke and said that she was very sorry that it was time for him to go. Adette froze in place, listening to their conversation. The Duke thanked Madame with a smile. He said that he would like to stay longer, but there were still matters in the capital that he needed to deal with as soon as possible. Adette flew into the room and asked the Duke if he was leaving today. She was surprised because she knew that he had not told her anything last night. He gazed at the young lady with a soft smile on his face. Madame looked closely at her daughter and said with a smile that everything was exactly like that. Since the Duke and her sister decided to return to the city, Adette was surprised that her sister also wanted to return. Madame looked at her daughter with a playful smile and said that she also went to Viola's. Adette froze in surprise and looked intently at her mother, who was smiling radiantly. Madame said with a smile that it seemed that the young people really wanted to get engaged. Adette froze in place and wondered what she expected. She was puzzled because for several days she had been in close contact with the Duke, as if she had become a special person to him. She was very worried and disappointed. The young lady looked closely at her family. She knew that she just needed to wake up and accept reality. The young lady looked closely at the Duke and said that he should confess officially. The Duke looked at her in surprise because he did not understand what she was talking about. He looked at her intently and wondered if all the young ladies from her family were confident in themselves. The Duke smiled and asked who he should confess to. He asked if she was really waiting for him to confess. Viola sighed heavily and said that of course she does not expect a confession from him since he must confess to her sister. She told the Duke that he had been interested in her sister from the very beginning. She looked at him closely and said that now he seemed to be very close to her sister. She could see that something was definitely going on between them. The Duke smiled and said that he did not know this. The young lady looked closely at the Duke and said that her sister is not smart in matters of love, and besides, she thinks about family first. She said that her sister was not honest with her feelings. The lady looked closely at the Duke and said that she remained silent because she needed rumors about her and the Duke. He looked at her in surprise because he did not expect to hear such a thing. She said that he should be more decisive, since he should understand perfectly well that it is difficult for girls. She said that he did not want scandalous rumors to surround her, because she did not get married at that age. The Duke was furious and wondered if the young lady was really saying that he and Adette shouldn't even see each other if they were just friends. He was furious because he understood that she wanted them to meet as a couple. He understood perfectly well that it was true that he was happy to be next to the young lady, but he never thought about the wedding. The butler looked closely at the Duke and said that he had received a message from Kamashi. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it seemed that he had found everything he said that he would go in person. The butlers looked at the Duke excitedly and said that a young lady had come to see him, and she spoke as if she had urgent business with the Duke. The Duke in turn rushed with lightning speed into the office where the young lady was waiting for him. He quickly entered the office and saw an excited young lady. Adette looked intently at the Duke and screamed, calling him. He felt unknown emotions as soon as he saw her expression. He looked at the young lady worriedly and asked what happened. He said that she should calm down and sit down. The young lady looked sideways at everyone in the room and asked the Duke to tell everyone to leave. The Duke looked intently at all the servants present and said that if necessary, he would call them and now they should go out. Now the Duke realized that all his thoughts were arrogant. The young lady, trembling, looked at the Duke and asked if he dropped her sister off in front of the mansion yesterday. The Duke looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and said that her sister said that she had something to do and asked to be dropped off in front of the dressing room. He said that he told her that he would wait for her, but she refused. The Duke looked at the young lady worriedly and asked what happened. Adette said in a trembling voice that her sister was missing. The Duke was shocked by what he heard. He stood up with lightning speed and told the young lady that she should wait a little and he would return. She looked at him in surprise. A moment later, the Duke entered the room with documents in his hands. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and handed her the documents. He said that her sister gave him a package of documents before getting out of the carriage and asked him to give it to her. Viola wrote to her sister that she was very sorry, but she was going to go far with her loved one. She wrote that she loved her family very much, but could never give up on her loved one. She asked her family not to look for her. Adette was shocked because she realized that this was her sister's handwriting. Now she realized that no one had kidnapped her sister, but she had escaped on her own. The young lady was in shock, as she did not know who her beloved sister had run away with. The Duke looked closely at the young lady, and with a sad expression on his face, said that he, unfortunately, did not know what happened, but if she needed help, then she could contact him at any time. The young lady looked closely at the Duke, and she thanked him with a smile, but said that he shouldn't do this at all. She sighed heavily, because she understood that in order to find her sister, she would really need the help of the Duke. But she was puzzled, because she did not know how she could tell him about this, since she could not kindly ask him to find a girl who apparently ran off with another man. The Duke looked closely at his companion and asked if her sister had really run away. She was taken aback and asked what he was talking about. She sighed heavily because for this reason, she did not like men who thought quickly. She looked closely at the Duke and said that it was not yet known. A moment later, the young man ran up to the young lady and called her in a hurry. The young man said that the butler asked him to give her an urgent letter, since he had learned the whereabouts of the young lady. Madame was furious and beside herself with anger. She was angry with the young man since he vilely repaid her favor. She was furious and did not understand how he dared to take her daughter. Adette. It was reported that the young lady ran away with Morris. The young lady was shocked and did not expect this from her assistant. She remembered how she told the young man that she needed to prepare a dowry for her sister since she would soon get married. Then he silently listened to her and did not answer anything. She remembered her sister asking her about business and investing. The young lady was puzzled, as only now did she understand why her sister was asking about business. She staggered as she felt sick for a moment. The Duke looked at the young lady excitedly and called out to her. Without showing himself for several days, he visited the boarding house, and they said that a few days ago he ran away with some girl. The servant slowly handed the young lady the letter that he had left for her. Morris wrote to the young lady that they were planning to go to the Empire. He wrote that, although he decided to follow the young lady's desire to leave this place, but he knew that the young lady could not cope on her own with the life of a commoner. He wrote that in a few days they would arrive at the border. He asked her to definitely follow her sister and convince the young lady. He hoped that she would come before it became too much late. The young lady was furious because she understood perfectly well that it was because of him that she had to dress up as a man again. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that it suited her very well. He said that this outfit was something he wore in his youth, but he was very glad that the clothes suited her. She looked at the Duke in surprise and wondered if it was really a compliment. She disguised herself for security reasons, since there are many robbers in the border area. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and asked what about her wearing his costume. She was shocked since he then openly told her to dress up as a man. She sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness for taking advantage of his help to such an extent. The Duke looked at her intently and said that in this situation, every hour is important, so this matter cannot tolerate delay. He said that he had already sent a messenger bird to the border, which could delay time until they arrived. He sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, they would have to drive all night without stopping to be able to catch up with them. The young lady glared at the Duke as she knew that he was almost engaged to her sister, but now he was reacting as if he didn't care at all. She was puzzled and knew that this simply could not be. The young lady sighed heavily and sincerely asked the Duke for forgiveness. The Duke smiled and said that he was fine, and she didn't need to worry about him at all. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she also thought that he was going to marry the young lady Viola. Adette froze in surprise, looking at the Duke. A moment later, she asked if this was not so. The Duke sighed heavily and said that this was not so at all. She thanked him, but still did not understand why he was helping her so much. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it did not mean anything. She looked at him in surprise and asked with embarrassment what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and said that it seemed to him that she had doubts about the reason for his kindness. The Duke, looking at the young lady, said that she considered her only the whim of a boring nobleman. He looked closely at the young lady and asked what she would do when she met her sister. She sighed heavily and said that it would be right to take her away before rumors spread, since if this situation was found out in high society, there would be scandalous rumors. She sighed heavily and said that the current family business and investment will turn into a bubble. But a moment later, she said that she would certainly listen to her sister's story. The Duke looked at her in surprise as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The real reason she was making money all this time was because of what she couldn't do in her previous life. It was she who wanted to protect the fortress called family. All, for the sake of protecting this fortress, she would bring her sister home. She did not know whether she would be truly happy and whether her family would be happy. She sighed heavily and said that she thought the scandalous rumors would subside over time and she could start the business again. The Duke froze in surprise since he did not expect to hear such a thing from her. She sighed heavily and said that her sister would have to hide herself for the rest of her life for the sake of preserving the honor of the family. She said that she would really like her sister to be happy. The Duke turned his gaze away from the young lady and said that she was much more romantic than he thought. He said that she should be realistic. He sighed heavily and thoughtfully, said that her sister had lived all her life as an aristocrat, and at the same time in the morning she would become a commoner. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that the Duke was right, since she was well aware that her sister did not know what it was like to go out of her way to survive. She wondered if her sister had chosen such a life for herself. A few days later, we finally arrived at the border. The young lady looked around in a hurry. A moment later, she finally found her sister. She screamed and called her. Viola shuddered when she saw her sister in the distance. Adette glared at her sister, and a moment later she ran after her. She screamed and called for her sister, but it was no use. Viola froze in surprise as she saw that her lover had caught her and was holding her. She screamed and demanded that he let her go. She looked at her intently and asked why he stopped her. She shouted that they should leave quickly. Adette was breathing heavily after a hard run. The young people looked at the young lady in surprise. Adette looked intently at her sister and called out to her with tears in her eyes. She slowly walked up to her sister and told her to talk to her. Viola stared at her sister and asked in a trembling voice if she could just pretend she didn't see her. The young lady looked at her sister in surprise. Viola looked at her sister with tears in her eyes and said that this was her last request. Morris looked closely at the young lady, for he did not at all think that she would come alone. He was surprised that she came with the Duke. He looked at the young lady closely and said excitedly that knowing the Duke, he would not sit idly by, and the young lady would be in trouble. Viola looked at him and said with a smile that he should not worry about such things since the Duke, and so did not want to marry her. She looked at her lover with a gentle smile and said that the Duke was only testing his interest in her family because of her older sisters. She was sure that he would certainly help Adette if she got into trouble. The young lady looked closely at her sister and asked if she would regret this choice. Viola looked closely at her sister and said with a smile that, as she said earlier, there will be difficult moments, but still, this is the life that she chose herself. Looking at her sister, she said that she had always lived the way others expected of her. But when she fell in love with Morris, she realized what she herself wanted. The young lady looked closely at her sister, but did not answer. Viola smiled and said that if she marries the man she chooses, she will be able to live comfortably, but in this way she will only deceive her heart. She looked at her sister with a radiant smile and said that she was sure that if she were with Maurice, she would be able to overcome any difficulties. The young lady smiled and agreed with her sister. She knew that during this time, she had never tried to listen to her sister. She measured her happiness by her standards, but she hoped that it was not too late. She looked closely at her sister and handed her the precious necklace with a smile. She said that she was in a hurry, so this is all she has. The young lady hugged her dear sister tightly and warmly. Adette hugging, her sister said that if it suddenly becomes difficult for her, she can return home at any time. The young lady was shocked as she did not expect to hear such a thing from her sister. She hugged her tenderly. The young lady looked at her assistant and called to him. The Duke looked at the young man in surprise as he looked like a puppy. A moment later, the Duke flinched as the young lady beat her assistant a little. Viola looked at her sister in surprise and with tears in her eyes as she did not expect this. Adette looked at them and said that this was a punishment for deceiving her. She looked at the young man and said that if her sister cried, she would come to him and punish him. He sighed heavily and said that he remembered everything. The young lady looked closely at her sister and said goodbye to her with tears in her eyes. She hoped that her sister would be happy. The young lady was puzzled because the road back was simply terrible. When she was driving behind her sister, she was so out of her mind that she did not notice the bad road. She had not slept for several days, and it was hard for her. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that she seemed very ill. He asked if she was okay. She sighed heavily and said that she was not okay at all. He looked at her intently and asked if she would like to rest a little in that case. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke said with a radiant smile that there was his property nearby. They could go there and rest a little. She looked closely at the Duke and said that she thought it would be better for them to go back, since her mother was very worried. Cade looked closely at the young lady and said that he had already sent the letter, Madame. He looked at her intently and said that if she was overworked now, she might get sick like last time. She knew that worrying about her mother was half the excuse. She was puzzled and wondered what if there were rumors that the eldest daughter of the family was wearing men's clothes. She sighed heavily and said that her appearance was not very good. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about, since she now looked very beautiful. She was shocked because she understood that he was just teasing her. She had oily hair and skin that had not been washed for several days. The Duke tenderly touched her face and smoothly touched her hair. The young lady froze in surprise in place. He looked at her intently and told her with a soft smile that she didn't need to worry at all. He smiled and said that the people of Kameish are not the talkative ones. The young lady in turn looked at the Duke with embarrassment as she did not expect this. He smiled and said that they could safely go to the residence. The butler greeted his master with a smile. A moment later, they froze in surprise. Everyone froze, looking at the young, beautiful lady who was coming down. Adette was surprised, since he even accompanied her. Everyone looked at the young lady with admiration, as they could see that the Duke had brought a new mistress to them. Adette frozen, in place in shock, but with a smile on her face. She understood that they were looking at her with heavy gazes. She knew that they all simply misunderstood everything. The Duke looked intently at everyone present and introduced the young lady to everyone. He said that they should not cause her discomfort. Some time later, the young lady was sitting in a beautiful bathtub. She sighed heavily as she knew that she would never be able to ride in hired carriages again. She knew that it was very nice to live a life where you were taken care of. She wasn't ready to give up everything and run away. For a moment, she wondered how strong her sister's love was. She didn't know what prompted her to come to such a decision. She looked closely at her sister and asked, since when? She didn't understand why sister didn't say a word to her. She sighed heavily and said that she needed rumors in order to force the young man who loved her to act. She looked closely at her sister and said with a smile that thanks to this, she also learned about the true feelings of another person. Adette looked at her sister with bewilderment. Viola looked at her sister with a smile and said that she should do what her heart tells her. She looked closely at her sister and said that their mother wanted a good relationship between the Duke and their family. She asked her sister, why doesn't she marry the Duke instead of her Adette? Was shocked. She didn't expect to hear something like that. The young lady sighed heavily because she knew that there would be no marriage. She really wanted to enjoy life for a long time. A moment later, the young lady heard a noise outside. The maid said that the owner was not there, and it was forbidden to enter the room. The young lady in turn became wary, and she became very scared. She froze in shock and surprise when the door opened and a young man entered the room. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and noticed that the Duke was really not there. He asked for forgiveness with a smile and ran away with the speed of lightning. The young lady in turn screamed, and her scream spread throughout the entire estate. After taking a bath, the Duke heard the scream of a young lady. With the speed of lightning, he ran into the bathroom where the young lady was. He was excited and wanted to know what happened. He froze in surprise when he saw the young lady with tears in her eyes. Cale froze in place with embarrassment when he saw the young lady. The maid looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what he was doing here. She shouted that he, without even getting dressed again, grabbed his sword. The Duke left the premises with lightning speed and asked the lady's forgiveness. He said that, due to the loud noise, he thought that a stranger had entered her room. She looked closely at the Duke, but did not answer. The maid looked at the Duke closely and said that a stranger was here. She said that the prince suddenly walked into the bathroom, and the lady was very scared. The Duke in turn was furious. He could not believe that the prince had unceremoniously burst into the bathroom. The prince looked intently at everyone present, and with an innocent smile said that it was really his mistake. The young lady looked closely at the prince with a smile on her face. She wondered if he really didn't know any manners. The Duke angrily told the prince to politely ask for forgiveness. The prince hesitated, looking at the Duke. He understood that he could not get away with it. He asked the young lady for forgiveness. The prince timidly looked at the young lady and asked for forgiveness for watching her in the bathroom. He sighed heavily and said that even though it was his mistake, he was still very rude to the young lady. The prince in turn looked sideways at the Duke because he wanted to know if he was satisfied. The Duke did not answer anything and silently began to eat. The prince looked sideways at the Duke and asked if this was too much for raising a sword. The prince said that he really thought that the Duke had been infiltrated by an intruder. The Duke sighed heavily and told the prince that he had come to him despite the fact that he was not even invited. The Duke was surprised because even when he picked up the sword, the prince could not say anything. The prince was shocked. He said that he was very offended. The prince said that the Duke rented a carriage and left the capital with the girl. He looked closely at the Duke and said with a smile that he thought that the Duke was ready to run away for love. Everyone froze in shock in place. The Duke angrily told the prince that he did not seem to trust him. The prince said that he trusted, but he could not trust the people around him. The young lady froze in place and wondered if he was really talking about her now. The prince looked at the Duke intently and said that he could not even think that the Duke would return to the estate with the young lady. She was in shock, wondering if she could not come to the estate. The prince told the Duke that he thought that he brought a girl for fun for one night. The young lady in turn choked on her tea as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She was in shock, wondering what the prince was even talking about. The Duke looked at the prince with fury and asked if he was now trying to insult him. The prince looked at the Duke with a smile and said that it was just a joke. He didn't understand why the Duke was so serious. The young lady was puzzled. She didn't understand what happened to the atmosphere in the hall. She looked closely at the prince and wondered if he was being too untied, even for a childhood friend. She knew that if anyone saw them now, they would think that they were siblings. The prince said with a smile that the dinner was simply wonderful, and he also asked the Duke if he wanted to organize a ball on the occasion of his arrival in Kamash, since he wanted to listen to the stories of the nobles living near the border. The Duke said that they were leaving for the capital tomorrow morning. The prince was surprised and did not understand why there was such a rush. The prince shouted that it took him several days to come to the estate. He said that it was too cruel and asked them to stay a little. The young lady sat quietly and listened to their conversation, since the prince reminded her of the whims of her little sister. She thought that her mother is now finding it difficult to take care of her sister. The Duke looked closely at the prince and said that he was returning to the capital, as he had a lot to do. And also, the Viscountess was already waiting for the young lady at home. The prince looked closely at the Duke and said that he could send a letter to the Viscountess, and this problem would be solved. The Duke looked closely at the prince, as he saw that he was very stubborn. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She did not want to stay at all. She knew that normally her mother would have been happy about the letter, but not now that her sister had run away. She was well aware that this situation would only exacerbate her stress. The young lady looked closely at the Duke, but did not answer. The Duke looked closely at the prince and said that they could send the young lady first, and they would go hunting together. The prince sighed heavily, and like a capricious child, said that he did not want this. He said that he also wanted to go with the young lady, since he would like to take this opportunity to make friends. The Duke looked closely at the prince and said that this would be very difficult for the young lady. The prince looked at those present with bewilderment, as he did not understand what was so difficult. The young lady, in turn, saw that the more the Duke stood up for her, the more active the prince's resistance becomes. The young lady looked closely at the prince and said with a smile that she was honored that he thought positively of her. She said that she would follow his wishes and stay for a while. The prince looked closely at the young lady, and a moment later said with a smile that it was very good that she understood what he wanted. The prince sighed heavily and said that the young lady is very calculating, and she also thinks quickly. He sighed heavily and said that it is dangerous to keep such a girl next to you. He looked closely at the Duke and asked why he shouldn't get closer to her. The Duke in turn did not answer the prince's words. A moment later, he looked at the prince and said that he had already been informed that all the letters had been found. The prince looked closely at the Duke. A moment later, he asked in bewilderment whether it was possible that the young Lady Bourse had misled everyone. The Duke said that all that needed to be done was to deal with the letters and return. He was puzzled, as he did not understand why they should have a ball. He told the prince that he had only tired him. The prince sighed heavily and said that he has a reason for this. The prince said that the crown princess could place a person with him. He asked the Duke with a grin on his face if he shouldn't pretend to be a carefree person attending balls in the outskirts. In turn, the Duke supervised all preparations for the upcoming celebration. At the same time, the prince enjoyed his rest and preparations for the holiday. The young lady, in turn, unfortunately, could not enjoy the preparations. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that this outfit suited her very well. Adette was shocked because she had nothing to breathe. She was puzzled because she couldn't even breathe deeply. The maid said with a smile that this outfit belongs to Her Highness the Crown Princess. For this reason, it does not suit most people. She looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that this outfit suits her very well. Adette was surprised, as she did not expect to hear something like that. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that when she was young, the princess often came to see them. She smiled and said that the three of them got along very well with each other, and the princess followed her master everywhere. The maid smiled and said that every day he competed with His Highness the Prince and Her Highness the Crown Princess. He was always the mediator between them. She was surprised that the Crown Princess's outfit was left in the estate. She wondered if the princess was the Duke's first lover. The young lady sighed heavily. She felt very tight in this outfit. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that if it was hard for her, she would loosen the corset a little later. A moment later, the maid told the master that she had brought the lady to him. The young lady, in turn, slowly entered the office. The Duke looked at her intently and said with a smile that he was very glad that she had come. He froze in shock as he looked at the young lady feeling unwell. He noticed her pale face. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the Duke as he wondered if he was really confused because she was in the dress of the Crown Princess. Adette could not stand it and collapsed to the ground. The Duke, in turn, picked up the young lady with the speed of lightning and called her, but it was all in vain. He was in shock and screamed with rage and asked how much they tightened the corset. He saw that she was not breathing. A moment later, the young lady came to her senses. The Duke loosened her corset with lightning speed. She was embarrassed, but still glad that she could breathe deeply. The Duke looked intently at the young lady and asked for forgiveness. Adette looked at the Duke with bewilderment because she did not understand what he was talking about. He said that he would like to apologize for touching her body without permission, since this situation looked very dangerous. She looked at him intently and said that it was done very skillfully. The Duke froze in surprise in place. He shouted that this was not so, since the men's outfit was the same. She did not answer anything because she knew that he had helped her, and she should have forgotten about this incident. The young lady looked closely at the Duke and asked why he called her. He smiled and said that he had something for her. A moment later, he opened the box and showed her a beautiful set of jewelry. He smiled and asked if she liked the necklace. On the border, the young lady was taken aback, since she had never seen such a beautiful set before. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if he could do it himself. She froze in surprise, and looking at the Duke, wondered why he was giving such a set to her. He smiled and said that she did not need to worry, but that she should just accept it, as his apology. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he really hoped that she would take this necklace as a gift for coming to his estate. The young lady froze with embarrassment. She could not utter a word. The Duke, in turn, looked closely at the young lady with embarrassment. She turned around and thanked him with a smile, but a moment later, she froze in place with embarrassment since he was too close. Just a little more, and their lips would have touched in a passionate kiss. But the Duke walked away from the young lady with the speed of lightning. He was very embarrassed. Clearing his throat, he said that they needed to go to the ballroom. She looked after him in bewilderment. The young lady looked closely at the Duke, for she saw that he was as embarrassed as she was. Everyone was animatedly whispering and discussing this event. They said that they missed the crown princess as they had before. They said that when they came here, they thought that the princess and His Highness Prince Wishart would get married. The young lady froze in surprise at what she heard, since she had previously heard that in childhood they were like a cat and a dog. She sighed heavily as she knew that she simply didn't know anything about the relationship between a man and a woman. The prince slowly approached the young lady and froze in place, in surprise. He looked at her intently and called, while he said the name of the princess. The young lady in turn turned around, and the prince froze in surprise as he saw Adette. The young lady in turn greeted the prince. He looked at her in surprise as he did not expect to see her at all. Adette looked at the prince in bewilderment, as she did not understand his reaction. He took his gaze away from her and said that this outfit did not suit her at all. She was shocked as he suddenly appeared again and picked on her again. He said with a smile that the outfit was luxurious, and the necklace and earrings sparkled, but the lady was not visible at all. He turned around with a grin and looked for her. She was furious because she knew that if he were not a prince, then she would just hit him. A moment later, the Duke approached them and asked the prince in bewilderment what he was doing. The Duke looked closely at the prince and said that his behavior was very childish. The prince screamed because he did not expect to hear such a thing. The young lady breathed a sigh of relief as she was very happy to see the Duke. The Duke, in turn, looked intently at the young lady and with a smile asked if she would dance with him. She froze in surprise in place, but still, sometime later, they danced playfully. The prince, in turn, looked intently and disappointedly at the young people. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it seemed to her that the prince did not like her. The Duke smiled and said that the prince was just jealous because they were close. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Duke smiled and said that even if it were not her but other girls, he would not like his close communication with them. She looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She wondered if the prince really had other preferences. The Duke smiled and, looking at the young lady, asked why she was reacting this way. Cade looked at his young companion with a smile and said that the prince cared about him very much as his assistant. She smiled and said that she understood everything. He looked closely at the young lady and said that she seemed to have no prejudices. He looked at her with a gentle smile and said that this was his first time meeting a person like her. The young lady, in turn, looked at the Duke with embarrassment, but did not answer. Cade shyly averted his gaze from the young lady and said that it was a little hot in the hall. He asked if she wanted to go out. They walked leisurely around the grounds. He smiled and asked if she liked the environment here. He smiled and asked if she felt freer since no one was here, and no one knew her. She exhaled heavily and said that everything was exactly like that, and if it were the capital, they would not be able to walk like that. since rumors would quickly spread. The Duke looked at the young lady with a smile. A moment later, she froze in place with surprise, since it was the first time she had seen such a large moon. He smiled and said that there was simply a beautiful night sky on the border. The young lady said with an admiring smile that this is exactly so, and the view is truly beautiful. She looked at the beautiful sky and moon with admiration, as she saw that the landscape was very beautiful. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that her eyes were like this moonlight. She froze in surprise in place. She felt the night air under the light of the moon. It was intertwined with the scent of violets. She did not know whether it was due to the moonlight or because of the tight corset. It was difficult for her to breathe. She closed her eyes because she saw that the Duke was approaching her and reached out to her face. The Duke slowly walked closer to her and leaned towards her. The young lady closed her eyes, but still she felt his breath close. Moments later, she opened her eyes as she realized that nothing had happened. The Duke looked at her intently and with a smile asked for forgiveness for frightening her. He said that a leaf just fell on her. She looked at the Duke in embarrassment and bewilderment. A moment later, the Duke turned around because he heard someone calling him the young lady, in turn stood embarrassed in the distance. The Duke looked at his servant in surprise and asked what happened. Adette, in turn, moved away and covered her face with her hands. She was very embarrassed because she was expecting something different. She was puzzled because she didn't understand why she closed her eyes at such a moment. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that he had urgent business and would be back soon. He told his subordinate that now it could be dangerous and he should see the young lady off. She shouted that this should not be done, and she, after walking a little more, Adette ran away from the Duke with the speed of lightning. Some time later, the young lady of the forces sat quietly on the bench. She was puzzled because she was very ashamed. She wondered how she could look into the eyes of the Duke now. She realized that only she was very excited. A moment later, she froze in place and wondered if she really loved the Duke. But a few minutes later, she was struck by a strong trembling. She did not understand what happened and why she felt the icy cold. She turned around with lightning speed as she felt someone's gaze on her. The Duke looked at the man and said that he had done a very good job of finding everything. He handed the young man the bag of payment and said goodbye to him. The prince, in turn, carefully examined the new documents. He was furious as he perfectly understood that his life was in danger because of some kind of love letter. With the speed of lightning, he threw all the documents into the fireplace and said that they were done with this. The Duke sighed heavily and said that this was just the beginning. The prince sighed heavily and said that if the truth came out, the Duke would also be in danger. The Duke looked closely at the prince and said that this would never happen since all the people who knew the truth were already dead. The prince was puzzled. He looked sideways at the Duke and said that this was not so. He knew very well that there was one more person left, and that was the princess. The Duke looked at the prince closely and said that even if she was the crown princess, she could not do anything without strong evidence. The prince smiled and said that he was encouraged that the Duke stood by his side. The prince slowly approached his friend and with a soft smile said that he was the only one he could trust. With the speed of lightning, the prince changed his face and looking at the Duke said that he should not forget this. The young lady froze in place and looked intently into the distance. A moment later, a maid ran up to her and called her. She looked at the young lady excitedly and asked if she had really been here all this time. She looked closely at the maid and wondered if that intense cold was because of the wind. Adette told the maid to loosen her corset a little. The maid smiled and said that she would do everything and lead her to the room. The young man looked intently at the young lady's trail. The maid looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she liked the garden. She smiled and said that the garden was beautiful, even in the night sky. She suddenly remembered the Duke, who said that her eyes were like moonlight. She froze in place with embarrassment, with a smile on her face, since this was the first time such words had been spoken to her. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she seemed to be having fun in the garden. Adette hesitated, not knowing what to answer. The lady looked sideways out the window as she felt someone's presence. A moment later, a young man burst into her room through the window with a sword in his hands. She froze in shock, looking at the man. The man cut into the air with his sword as fast as lightning. The young people looked warily into the distance as they heard someone scream. A moment later, they heard that the estate was under attack. With the speed of lightning, the Duke rushed into the young lady's room. He saw that she was sitting on the ground, trembling with fear. The maid excitedly looked at the Duke and called him a. The Duke froze in surprise. He saw the frightened face of the young lady. The young lady, in turn, sat quietly on the ground, trembling with fear. Her face turned pale. The maid screamed, looking at the master. She said that Blythe burst into their room. The prince was shocked, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at the maid and asked where the young man had disappeared. The prince looked at the Duke and said that they needed to quickly catch up with the young man. But the Duke, in turn, rushed to the young lady with the speed of lightning. He quickly approached her and asked if she was okay. He was worried that she might be injured. She was taken aback and looked at the Duke with a smile. She said that she was fine. The maid screamed that the young man had only cut the young woman's outfit lady and immediately ran away. The prince looked closely at the Duke but said nothing. A moment later, he left the room and said that the party was over for today. The prince said that he was returning to the capital. The prince looked closely at the Duke and said that he should deal with the young lady. The Duke was surprised since the prince started this conversation. The Duke looked intently at the prince and said that there was nothing to deal with here. The prince looked at the Duke in surprise and asked why he didn't immediately chase the young man. The Duke froze in place, not knowing what to answer. He was surprised by such a question. The prince angrily told the Duke that this was not like him at all. In turn, the Duke clenched his fists with rage. He sighed heavily and said that it was useless. The prince looked at his friend in bewilderment, but did not answer. A moment later, the prince looked at the Duke with a smile and said that he was good at such things. He smiled, looking at the Duke, and said that if he is hiding something, it does not mean that it is hidden. The Duke looked closely at the prince but did not answer. The prince sighed heavily and said that he really hoped that the Duke would not spoil anything because of some kind of love. A moment later, the prince left. The Duke looked in bewilderment at the departing prince. The maid looked closely at the princess and said with a smile that she had brought her tea that would help her fall asleep quickly. The princess said that she understood everything and sent the maid off. For some time, the princess looked intently out the window, but a moment later, she heard that someone had come to her. She smiled as she was waiting for the person. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he had found what he was looking for. The young man knelt down and asked the princess for forgiveness. He said that, unfortunately, he could not find it. The princess, in turn, looked at the young man with rage, as she was not ready to hear such a thing. The young lady sat quietly and gazed at the fireplace. She remembered the eerie energy that emanated from the man. She realized perfectly well that it was the same man whom she had seen in Lenocia. She looked closely at the maid and asked if she knew the man who had come to her recently. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was talking about Bland. She said that of course she knew him since he was from Kamash. She sighed heavily and said that he was so talented that the past Duke treasured him very much. And he was the fencing teacher of the Duke and the Prince. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. But in turn, she wondered why he became such a person. The maid said that this was the year when the young marquise became crown princess. He suddenly disappeared, and everyone was looking for him for a long time. But he suddenly showed up. Adette was surprised, and did not understand why he did this to her, since she knew that he was a person who was not related to her. A moment later, she understood everything perfectly as she decided to get married again. She remembered the moment when she and the Duke stood by the fountain and enjoyed the beautiful view. The young lady was shocked and wondered if it was all because the Duke made her heart flutter. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and called her. Adette said that she was fine. With a pale face, she said that she had already come to her senses. She told the maid to pack the clothes she came in as she was about to return home. The Duke looked closely at the young lady, but said nothing. Adette in turn sat quietly in the carriage and was silent. She looked closely at the Duke and said that she was also going to return home. He looked at her in surprise and said that, unfortunately, it was already late at night. He asked if she wanted to go back tomorrow at dawn. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she wants to go right now. He looked at her intently because he thought that she decided to return home, because she was very frightened. He was puzzled because he did not understand why her behavior had changed strangely. The young lady, in turn, bowed and asked the Duke to be careful on the road. With the speed of lightning, she left him. The Duke, in turn, looked after the young lady with his sadness. The butler stared at the young lady with tears in her eyes. Adette calmed him down and said that he had done a very good job. She looked at the butler and asked where her family was now. He said that they were now at Terusaf's residence. Adette sighed heavily, and looking at the butler, said that no one must have served her because it had been empty for a long time. The butler looked closely at the young lady and said that Madame asked to give her a letter when she arrived. Madame wrote about her daughter, that she would be resting at her grandfather's residence for some time. She told her daughter that she knew that she did not leave because of business matters. She wrote to her daughter that if she could not find her sister before other rumors appeared in secular society, she should say that her sister went on vacation with her to the estate. She was shocked and couldn't believe that in such a situation she was dancing at the ball and having a fun time. The butler stared at the young lady and called her. He sighed heavily and said that during her absence, a lot of things had accumulated. She entered the office and froze in surprise, because she thought it was just a joke. At the same time in the duchy, the butler provided the Duke with a whole mountain of documents, which also needed to be sorted out. The butler looked closely at the young lady and said that construction had already begun in the Owl. He said that thanks to the patrol, they requested public order had improved markedly. The young lady smiled and said that this was very good. She looked at the butler in surprise and asked who this res was. He was mentioned several times in the report. The butler said that he was a young man who lived in the village and whose help greatly advanced the work, since he agitated the villagers to cooperate and suggested a solution to the problem with food supply. The young lady thought for a moment as she wanted to meet him in person. She understood very well that for a young man from the village, he was quite resourceful. She wondered if he really lived several lives. The butler looked closely at the young lady and asked if they should invite him to the residence. She smiled and said that perhaps they would do so. She was puzzled, as she had not left the office for a week. She wondered if they should rest for a while. The butler looked at her intently and said that she should do a few things and then rest. She sighed heavily, but still agreed with the butler. She was puzzled because she knew that without her assistant there was more work. The butler said that this matter would need permission from the royal palace, and approval was needed for at least 6 months. She was puzzled because she knew that it would take a lot of time. Her naledi wanted to find another option. She knew that she could quickly deal with this issue through a person who worked in the palace. She wanted to quickly find such a person. She looked closely at the butler and said that she needed a secretary to replace Morris. She told the butler to place an advertisement. A moment later, the Duke knocked on the young lady's office. He looked at her intently, with a smile on his face. He smiled and said that he could see she was very busy. The young lady jumped with a surprised smile, as she did not expect to see the Duke. He smiled, and looking at the young lady, asked if she had time for a cup of tea. She stared at him with a smile on her face, as she realized that she had let her guard down, as when she looked at his face, her heart melted. She mentally begged him to leave the estate. She sighed heavily and said that he should see that she had a whole mountain of things to do. She said that the next time he made an appointment, she would make time for him. He looked at her intently and asked if she really needed a competent secretary. She froze in surprise. The Duke said that he knew a capable man, and he was confident in him because he was doing a good job. He looked closely at the young lady and asked what she thought about this. She was in shock and no longer wanted to have connections with the Duke, but she knew that they had been in danger for a long time. Adette knew that it would be safer to work with the person for whom the Duke vouched. She looked closely at the Duke and said that in that case she had one request for him. The Duke sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, said that he would not keep too much distance from her. She looked at him in surprise, with embarrassment on her face. When leaving, he said that in the near future, he would send a person with a letter of recommendation. She was surprised she did not expect this. She gazed after him and remembered his face. A moment later, a maid entered the room, and with a smile asked the young lady to have lunch. Adette was taken aback, and looking at the maid, said that she scared her. The maid looked out of the window in surprise, and asked the young lady what she was looking at so intently. Odette, embarrassed, said that she wasn't looking at anything at all. The maid smiled and said that after all the young lady had something with the Duke. Odette sighed heavily and said that this was not so. The maid thought for a moment and said that this was very strange. She did not understand why he did this. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The maid said that throughout this week he had been coming to the residence. He asked if the lady had eaten well, if she had slept well, and if she had become ill again. The maid looked closely at the young mistress and said with a smile that he came with these questions every day. She was surprised and did not understand why such a busy man did such things. Odette froze in place with embarrassment. She was surprised because she did not expect to hear something like this. Now she understood why he had that expression on his face. She wondered if he was very offended. The maid looked at the young lady with a joyful smile and said that it seemed that the Duke was in love with her. Odette sadly said that even if this is not the case, nothing will change, since she is not going to get married at all, no matter who the applicant is. The maid froze in surprise. She did not answer anything. The prince looked at his companion in surprise and asked if Blythe had already come to the young lady burst twice. The young man sighed heavily and said that someone had ordered him. The prince thought for a moment and said that he thought this was the work of the princess, since the crown princess was keeping an eye on the young viscountess so she could use his services, even if it was just a trick. The Duke shouted with particular fury that this was very dangerous. The prince sighed heavily and told his friend that he should not stop him. He said that this time they must definitely complete the engagement. The Duke said angrily that he did not want the young lady to be drawn into their affairs. The prince looked closely at the Duke and asked if he was really going to deal with her. The Duke froze in surprise. He could not say anything to the prince. He was very alarmed by this situation. Many years ago, when the war ended, they made vows to each other. They wanted to eradicate the corrupt government from the empire. They hoped to usher in a new era. For them, it was a revolution, but for others, it was a rebellion. They did not at all want anyone to be involved in their business. For this reason, they did not keep close to them what was valuable to them. The Duke was puzzled, as this situation was very exciting. The prince sighed heavily and said that since the princess had rejected all his potential brides, there was not a single princess left who could become engaged to him. He said that if this engagement also went down, he would have to marry a relative of the crown princess. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had not forgotten their oath. He was very puzzled, as he was worried that the young lady would be in danger. He looked at the prince with fury and said that if her life was in danger, he could not guarantee how he would behave in this situation. The butlers informed the young lady that a man from the duchy had arrived. The young man said with a smile that this was their first meeting. He smiled and said that his name was Notos Bolin. The butler smiled and said that this was the man who was introduced by the Duke. Odette looked closely at the young man and thought that he would be better able to cope with a job that required physical strength than the work of a secretary. She said with a smile that she was very pleased to meet him. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really come alone. The young man was taken aback in surprise. He said that everything was exactly like that. Notos didn't understand what the problem was. Odette threw her extraneous thoughts out of her head because she was not thinking about what she needed. She smiled and said that that was not the problem. She looked closely at the young man and asked if he could start today's work. He smiled and said that he would start today. She looked at the butler and said that he should show the residence to the young man and give him the work. The butler looked closely at the young lady and said that there were quite a lot of letters and invitations. The young lady froze in shock when she saw a whole mountain of letters. Recently, the ladies from the Viscountess's family have not appeared in the social circle, and many rumors have been circulating among people. The young lady was puzzled. As she knew she had to go and explain everything, Odette was shocked, as she knew she had too much to do. She sighed heavily, and looking at the butler, said that it would be difficult for them for a while. She asked to answer the invitation on her behalf. He asked if she would even attend the ball of the Count Elwinch family. Odette knew that such an event as the ball of the Crown Princess's family would be attended by members of the imperial family and aristocrats. She sighed heavily and said that she thought she would have to go to get a business permit. The butler looked at the lady and said that the last letter was from the palace. She looked at him in surprise because she did not expect this. A moment later, the young lady noticed that she had received a letter from the prince. He invited her to go together to the ball of the marquise's family. He wrote that he would send a carriage to her house in honor of the memory of what happened on the Camache domain. The young lady was shocked and did not understand why he was asking her to come with him. She was furious and wondered what kind of rumors he wanted to spread about her family. She politely thanked the prince for his kindness, but she wrote that she was only a lady from the Viscount's family. She was worried about what she could become for him. She wrote that he should be accompanied by another person who would match him. The prince was shocked since the young lady refused him. He shouted that this was not in his plans. He shouted that she simply had to go with him. The young lady received another letter from the prince early in the morning. She was shocked and wondered if he was really so obsessed with escortings. She was puzzled because she didn't know what he was up to. She wondered if he really thought she would peacefully submit and agree. She knew that if he wanted to get something from her, he would have to give her something of equal value. The prince looked displeasedly at the young lady and asked how many times she refused him. Before agreeing after this incident, they exchanged letters several more times. She looked intently at the prince and said with a smile that as an entrepreneur, she would not act without her own benefit. She said that she needed to accompany the lonely prince. She was puzzled since already without him, there were enough rumors about her family. She was furious because she did not know how many more rumors would be spread by those who loved to chat. He looked intently at her and said that he understood everything. The prince looked at the young lady and asked what service she was talking about. A moment later, the young man, completely heard, shouted that the crown prince and princess were coming. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at the princess. She froze in surprise as she saw that the princess was simply amazing. She realized that the rumors were not true and she was incredibly beautiful. With tears in her eyes, she admitted that the princess dress did not suit her at all. Adette looked intently at the princess with a smile on her face as she realized that their eyes had met. She froze in surprise when she saw that the princess smiled at her. Some time later, the princess and her husband weighed and danced playfully. The young lady looked closely at the prince since she had previously heard that there was something between them. Thinking about this, she saw that the crown princess was not paying any attention to the prince. The young lady, in turn, wondered if this was really a one-sided love. A moment later, she realized that it was exactly like that. A few minutes later, all her thoughts disappeared as she saw the silhouette of the Duke in the distance. She froze in place with embarrassment as he glared at her. For some time, they gazed at each other from a distance. The young lady was a little puzzled and worried. She knew that she had come to the celebration with the prince. She wondered if this was why the Duke had misunderstood everything. The prince looked at the young lady and called her. Looking at his companion, he invited her to dance. She was puzzled because she did not want to do this at all. Now something was bothering her. The prince, in turn, looked intently at his companion and said that he had not heard the price of accepting his invitation. She said that she was going to build a residential complex on the ship plot in her domain, and for this, she needed permission from the palace. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she really had problems getting approval. The Duke, in turn, looked with displeasure at the young people who were dancing and talking merrily. She hesitated and said that it would take a lot of time. He smiled and asked if she really needed his influence. The young lady said with a smile that it was exactly like that. She looked at him intently and said that she was sure that she could ask him for this. The prince froze in surprise on the spot, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He smiled and asked if she knew that she was good at lying. Adette looked at him with embarrassment and said with a smile that she was telling him the truth. He smiled and said that he felt it from their first meeting. "She is very good and quick in calculations." Adnette said with a smile that she would take it as a compliment. The princess asked her friend who the lady was with the prince. The lady told the princess that she had told her before. The lady said that this was young Lady Viola Bercy's elder sister, Adette Berce. The princess looked intently and angrily at the young lady, since she understood who she was talking about. The young lady, in turn, really wanted to quickly come home and rest. She suffered throughout the reception, as everyone asked how she became close to the prince. Everyone asked where her sister was. A moment later, the prince approached Adette. Along with the Duke, the prince told the young lady that he would see her off. Odette was surprised. She did not expect this. Her companion looked at the prince with an admiring smile. She did not want him to accompany her, because she wanted to go home calmly. Milady thanked the prince for his concern with a smile. She said that she had decided to use the count's family's carriage. The young lady looked at everyone present with a smile and said that they did not mind, and Odette could safely ride along with the prince. Odette was shocked, because she understood that she now had no choice. Cade looked at the prince and, sighing heavily, said that he should just send the young lady home. The prince looked at his friend in surprise and asked why he should do this. He said that it would be right to escort the safety of his partner, with whom he danced together. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile and said that it was time for them to go. The Duke was shocked. The young lady in turn looked closely at the Duke, since she did not understand his behavior. A moment later, the Duke came closer to her and extended his hand to her. She froze, looking at the Duke. But a moment later, everyone had already accepted his hand. She looked at her and said that she had suffered an insult because of His Highness. He said that he was very sorry. The young lady looked at him intently and said that he did not need to apologize at all, since this is what she chose. Cade looked closely at the young lady's trail. He was puzzled by this situation. She thought for a moment as she remembered that she had not even thanked the Duke for sending her a secretary. The prince looked at the young lady with a displeased look and asked if she was really thinking about the Duke. Now, the young lady was taken aback and embarrassedly asked the prince what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and asked if she thought he didn't know she had feelings for the Duke. She was shocked and wondered how he knew. Odette was puzzled and confused, and wondered if it was that obvious. The prince said with a smile that the Duke was still the second most attractive in the kingdom after him. The young lady looked intently at her companion. He changed faces with lightning speed, and with cold fury asked what she was up to. He asked if she really intended to become a duchess. The prince said that after this, she would not have to exhaust herself with business, and just marriage with the Duke would be an honor for her family. The young lady looked at the prince with fury. She did not understand what he was talking about now. Not knowing anything, she understood perfectly well that everything was the opposite, and if she got married, her life would come to an end. She was furious because she understood that he must first find out about everything and then start talking. Odette sighed and said that she thought they all misunderstood her, because she was interested in doing business, and she never thought of it as a grueling job. She looked intently at the prince and said that she did not even think about getting married for the sake of the family. The prince froze in surprise in place, since he did not expect to hear such a thing. She said she didn't know what he was worried about, but Duchess, that's not the status that can be achieved with just one desire. She looked closely at the prince and said that marriage is not the decision of one person. He said that everything is exactly like that. He looked at her intently and said that he just asked it because he was worried that they were both worried about it. The prince said, looking at the young lady, that the Duke never seemed to have such a thought. She froze, looking at the prince, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, she said that he did not need to worry about her at all, so how she understands everything perfectly. Looking out the window, the prince said that if this is so, then he is very happy. The young lady looked closely at her sister. She was very happy to see her. Madame also greeted her daughter with a smile. Odette looked at her sister in surprise, as she did not expect to see a puppy. Sasha smiled and said that he was very cute, and the Duke gave him to her. The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Sasha smiled and said that everything was exactly like that, and he sent the puppy not so long ago. Madame said with a smile that everything was correct, and the Duke also sent them a new piano. Madame looked closely at her daughter and asked if the Duke knew what her daughter had done. Odette sighed heavily and told her mother that he knew about everything. Madame sadly said that she understood everything. Madame looked closely at her daughter with a smile on her face and said that she originally thought that the Duke was taking care of their family because of the Violas. Madame said with a smile that the estate workers told her that the Duke often came to see her. Odette, looking at her mother, said that it was all for business. Madame looked closely at her daughter and asked if she liked the Duke. Odette for a moment froze in place, not knowing what to answer. Madame asked her daughter if the Duke felt the same way as she did. The young lady said with sadness in her voice that the Duke seemed to never have such a thought. Adette was puzzled because she didn't even think that such words would make her feel cold in her soul. Madame looked at her daughter in surprise. She didn't know what to do. She was shocked because she had previously thought that she did not want this and did not expect this, but she was still in great pain. Madame quickly approached her daughter and said with sadness in her voice that she did not want to hurt her at all. Adette was shocked because she realized that she liked the Duke much more than she had thought before. Madame looked closely at her daughter and said that she still owed thanks to the Dukes. The lady, in turn, was a little worried and puzzled since she did not know what to write to her. After confessing her unrequited love, she could not calmly write him a letter. Adette understood that she could no longer come to him. Nothos looked intently at the young lady and asked if he should continue reading the report. She was taken aback and threw her thoughts away and said that he could continue. The young man looked closely at the young lady and said that he would like to tell her about the young man whom she invited to the residence last time. She remembered the capable commoner who helped her in many matters. Nothos said that he was informed that he had recently left those places and returned home. The young lady was surprised and, looking intently at her assistant, asked if the young man was not from those lands. He said that the inhabitants of the territory had been interviewed. They said that he looked like a wanderer. He asked the young lady if they should start looking for information about the young man. She sighed heavily and said that there was no need to look for him, but still, when he will appear, she would like to know about it. She knew that she should not waste her time on this at all. The young man said that he understood everything and also said that she had received an invitation from the palace. He asked what she would do about it. She was surprised because she did not expect to receive an invitation again. The young ladies were surprised and delighted since the Crown Princess's tea party was soon to take place. The young ladies asked to choose an outfit in the most luxurious style. The young lady looked at her companion with a smile and said that she was very jealous of her since she managed to get an invitation to a tea party. Adette said that she didn't even know how she managed to do it, since she didn't even know her personally princess. She didn't understand how the princess found out about her and invited her. The lady smiled and said that she was also interested in knowing this. The princess's maid stood quietly and listened to the conversation of the young ladies. A week later, there was a tea party in the royal palace. The maid looked closely at the young lady and greeted her. She said that she was a close maid of Her Highness the Crown Princess. Looking at the young lady, she said that the princess was waiting for her in the central garden. A moment later, they slowly walked into the garden. The maid looked closely at the princess and said that the young Viscountess Adette Bears had arrived for tea. According to all the rules of etiquette, the young lady greeted the princess and said that she was very glad to meet her. The princess looked at the young lady with a grin and said that she had an elegant outfit. She told the young lady to raise her head. Adette, in turn, froze in place in surprise. She was dumbfounded and surprised that they had the same outfits. Adette was shocked and could not understand how this could happen since she specially selected the outfit. The young ladies looked at the guest with grins. Adette looked intently at everyone present, as she now understood how it all happened. Adette understood perfectly well that she needed to immediately get out of this situation. She looked closely at the princess and said with a smile that, judging by her outfit, it had found its true owner. The princess looked at her intently and said that if you look closely, they have the same dresses. She smiled and said that she was honored to be dressed in the same outfit as her. Everyone watched silently. The princess looked closely at the young lady and said that she should come to her. The princess looked at one of the ladies and asked, could she please move? Adette was shocked, as she felt like she had stolen the young lady's seat. The princess looked at the lady and asked if she had come to the Marchioness's last ball. She smiled and said, lady, that she had heard a lot about her, and she wanted to meet. Adette was surprised, because she did not expect to hear something like this. They had a pleasant conversation for some time. Adette looked closely at the princess, as she was truly beautiful. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise and called her. Adette was taken aback and asked for forgiveness from the princess. She said that the princess was so beautiful that she, without realizing it, was staring too much. The princess looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was very honest. Everyone was watching him closely. A moment later, the princess said with a grin that she really likes such people, since she is very honest. With the speed of lightning, the princess's face changed. The young lady in turn looked at the princess in bewilderment. A moment later, the princess changed her face and looked at Adette with a beautiful smile. She smiled and said that she had heard the young lady was paying a visit to the Kamache. Adette looked at the princess with bewilderment, as she did not understand what had just happened. A moment later, she said that everything was true, and she was there. But in turn, she was surprised, since she did not know who told the princess about similar. She smiled and said that she had received an invitation from the Duke and stayed there for a couple of days. Everyone present was surprised and very jealous of the young lady that she was invited by the Duke himself. They asked if her sister was there. Adette said that unfortunately her sister was not there because she was unwell. The lady looked at Adette and said that there were rumors that the young lady Viola got sick because something happened between her and her friend. She asked Adette if these rumors were true. Adette was furious because the question that she asked directly. She did not understand how one could be so consistently straightforward. She looked intently at everyone present and said that these rumors had nothing to do with the Duke. She smiled and said that if it were all true, she would not have received an invitation from the Duke. She said that the Duke also stated that he is not going to marry her sister. The young ladies perked up and, looking at her, asked if it was true. They were surprised because they knew that he was out for a walk with her family and even invited them to his domain. Adette said with a smile that they were just talking about business. She knew that the standards of flirting in this world were a little different. The princess looked at the young lady and said that she worked very closely with the Duke regarding business. She sadly said that she had never gone to the estate after becoming the crown princess. She looked closely at the young lady and said that she was very jealous of her. The lady looked at her and asked if it really happened that she had accepted the accompaniment of the prince at the last ball, which is also closely connected with her business. Adette smiled and said that it was. So there is. She looked at the young lady with a grin and said that she seemed to be very good, since under the pretext of business she was meeting with the best candidates for the role of groom. The princess looked at her maid with a satisfied smile. Adette looked at the young lady and said that she doesn't know much about business, so she might have some questions and misunderstandings. She smiled and said, "Lady, if she thinks so, she might as well start running her own business." The lady smiled and asked why she would do this. She looked at Adette intently and with a grin, and said that her father does this. She said with a grin that she had completely forgotten that the Viscount had passed away. For this reason, the young lady had become the head of her family. She said that it must be very difficult for her, and the Viscountess must be very worried about this. The knight looked closely at the princess and called her. He said that he had come for her. The princess stood up with the speed of lightning, and looking at the knight, asked if the time had already come. Adette looked intently at the knight. She knew that it was Dipine Elvange, since he was running after her younger sister. The princess looked intently at everyone present and said with a smile that she had an urgent meeting due to a problem on the southern front, so she needed to leave. They slowly returned and had a casual conversation about what was happening in the south. They said that the knights would soon go to battle. The young lady said that this simply could not be, and she did not want to go to social balls without the Duke. The young lady looked intently into the distance as she saw a rather interesting spectacle. She noticed that in the distance the prince and the Duke were fighting with swords. She looked at the Duke in surprise and froze in place in embarrassment. The young lady looked closely at her friend and said that they could get closer to the men, since they now had a chance. The prince looked closely at the Duke and said that everything went smoothly thanks to the young lady, and the king signed before the princess knew about it. The Duke looked closely at the prince and asked if he was happy now. The prince said with a grin that he thought all this time he had not seen the young lady in a very good light. He smiled and said that she must definitely participate in their plan. The Duke in turn categorically said that this would not happen. With the speed of lightning, he parried the prince's blow. The young lady closely watched the battle with admiration in her eyes. The prince looked intently at the Duke and said that he would certainly agree with him, and if he won, the Duke looked at the prince in surprise and asked where he was looking all the time. The prince smiled and cried out, calling the young Viscountess. The Duke turned around in surprise, looking at the young lady. Adette froze in place from surprise and embarrassment. She did not at all expect that someone would call her. A moment later, the prince struck the duke with lightning speed and thereby knocked the sword out of his hands. The prince said with a smile that he had won this time. He smiled and said that whatever it was, the battle could not be distracted. The duke was unhappy, but did not answer. The prince smiled and said that it looked like the tea party was over. Looking at his friend, he said that they could go and meet the young lady. The duke looked at the prince in surprise and asked why he was calling her. He said that they could just go about their business. The prince looked at his friend with an onion grin and asked if he didn't miss the young lady. The prince smiled and, looking at the young lady, said that he was very glad to see her. Adette greeted the prince with a smile. He said that they could do without the greeting. He asked the young lady if she had received an invitation to the crown princess's tea party. She said that it was exactly like that. He smiled and said that it was very good. He asked if the princess had asked her anything. She looked closely at the prince and wondered if he had called her just because he wanted to. Interesting, Adette said that the princess asked if she came to Kamashu. He looked at her in surprise and asked if that was all. He asked me if the other ladies had said anything. She knew that she could not say that they were jealous of the relationship between her family and the duke. She sighed heavily and said that they did not say anything. She looked closely at the duke. The prince asked, with a sly smile, if it was true. A moment later, a knight ran up to them and called the prince. The knight said that at a meeting of civil servants, an agenda was adopted on the need to send the duke to the southern front. The young people froze in shock and surprise on the spot. The prince jumped up with rage and, looking at the knight, asked what he was talking about. The young lady, in turn, looked at the duke in confusion. She wondered if he would really go to war. The prince shouted with rage that she was the southern front. 6 orders of knights had already left. The knight said that the situation with the defense of the southern lands was getting worse and worse. An opinion was expressed about the management of the punitive detachment. The prince was shocked, since they were talking about a punitive detachment in a situation where it is unknown how many troops the enemy has. He looked closely at the knight and asked if he was really saying that the first commander was being sent to a place far from the capital. The prince was furious and could not understand who made such a stupid decision. The young lady looked intently at those present. She wondered if the princess was really involved in all of this. She remembered the princess saying with a sly smile that she had an urgent meeting regarding a problem on the southern front. A moment later, the young lady froze in surprise as she heard the princess calling her. The princess looked at the young lady with a grin and said that it looked like she had not yet left Adette. Trembling said that she was glad to meet her again. The prince looked closely at the princess and asked if all this was true. He asked if she had really decided to assign control of the punitive detachment on the southern front. The princess looked at the prince with a smile and said that everything was right, although the final decision had not yet been made. She looked closely at the prince and asked with a smile, "Isn't it the fastest and most reliable?" She smiled and said that if the duke stands in the vanguard, many nobles will be calm. The prince shouted that the duke should not leave the capital. He angrily asked the princess, "Doesn't she know what it means to leave the capital by the first commander?" She smiled and said that the capital was full of other knights. The young lady was shocked. So how well she understood that the person who decided to send the duke to the battlefield was the crown princess. She said that many knight orders had been sent, but if they sent his squad, they would advance faster. The princess looked at the young lady with a grin and asked if she agreed. Adette looked at the princess in surprise, as she did not at all expect to hear such a question. She froze in shock and bewilderment, as she did not understand why the princess was asking her. The duke looked closely at the princess and said that if necessary, he would willingly go to war. The lady froze in surprise. The duke looked closely at the princess and said that there were already enough knights on the southern front, and since the viscount was a man of great skill, they could rest easy. The princess looked furiously at everyone present and said that she had asked a question to the young lady. The young lady in turn was taken aback. She did not understand why they were doing this to her. She knew that the crown princess had come to the tea party wearing the same outfit as her, and now she was asking her questions regarding politics. She was puzzled and wished they would fight each other and not drag her into something like this. She understood perfectly well that she had no intention of standing on anyone's side, but the fact that they wanted to send the duke to war hurt her greatly. She did not want this at all. She said that being the daughter of a viscount's family, who had no position, she knows only this about the affairs of the country. Adette looked closely at the princess and said that war is the business of knights. There are people in the capital drinking tea. They are under the protection of the knightly order. The young lady said that this is not a topic that she can freely talk about. The princess froze in surprise in place. The duke, in turn, with the speed of lightning, rushed to the young lady and called her. He was shocked because of the words that she said. In turn, the prince could barely restrain his laughter. She smiled, but in turn was very scared, and wondered if she had said something wrong. She was puzzled and wondered if she had made a mistake. She said that there were people in the capital who drank tea, and they were under the protection of the knightly order. She now realized that she was talking about the princess and her kind. She was shocked because she realized that she had screwed up. Trembling with fear, she asked the princess for forgiveness, but the princess only grinned, looking at the young lady. The duke looked at the princess closely and said that Adette, being an entrepreneur, she does not understand politics well. He said that she said this without realizing it, so the princess should forget about this incident and not listen to her. The princess turned around with the speed of lightning and said that of course she would not take her words to heart. The duke looked intently at the young lady and said that she too had better go home. She is to blame, she agreed with him. The prince walked up to the young lady with a smile and said that surprisingly she also has weaknesses. Adette was furious and wondered if he was teasing now. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she really had the same dress as the crown princess. She froze in place, but a moment later said that it was so. He sighed heavily and said that he could tell what happened at the tea party without looking. He looked at her intently and softly said that she must be very tired. The young lady was surprised. She did not expect to hear kind words from the prince. She looked at him intently and thanked him. The prince smiled, looking at his friend, and asked, why not see the young lady off? Cade stood quietly to the side and did not answer. The young lady looked in bewilderment in the direction where the duke was looking. With the speed of lightning, the duke began to leave. He said that there was no need for this. He asked the young lady to be careful on the way. Adette froze in place in surprise, as she did not expect this from him. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had enjoyed her tea. Adette was very tired. She asked her maid not to talk to her. Camilla looked at the young lady excitedly and asked what happened. Adette was upset and said that she would like to be alone. When leaving, the maid said that the young lady could call her at any time, and she would come quickly. Adette in turn agreed to be the maid. She lay quietly in bed and thought about what had happened. She remembered all the moments, and she remembered that. Then the duke looked intently at the crown princess. Adette was in shock and didn't know what to do because she was jealous of the one who was already married. She was upset because she realized that she couldn't even do anything. She told herself that she was just pathetic. A young man was riding in a carriage and reading a letter. His sister wrote that she was doing well, and she also wrote that she heard that he had been in Owl not long ago. She asked if he was enjoying the trip. She wanted to know where is he now, because I missed him very much. He brought the candle to the letter and saw that there was a message hidden there. She wrote that everything turned out the way her new mother wanted, and soon she would go to the kingdom. She hoped to see him before that day. He furiously pressed the letter in his hand. The knight looked intently at him and called. He asked His Highness if he would return home now. He said that, unfortunately, he could not do this now. It was too late and they had to find another way. He looked closely at the knight and told him not to call him here. So he looked closely at the knight and said that upon arrival in this kingdom, he would be able to meet the owner of the owl. The Tsar said that everything was exactly like that. He knew that she was an aristocrat with a sense of responsibility. This was unexpected for him, since she was the owner of the owl. He knew that she considered him a commoner, and he wanted to leave everything as it was. He slowly approached her, as he was wondering if she would recognize him. Madame looked closely at the young viscountess and greeted her with a smile. Adette, with a smile, thanked the countess for her invitation. The countess said that she was very sorry that Mrs. could not come to this event, but at least the young lady came to greet her. Adette knew that the countess was her mother's best friend, and she could not refuse her a visit. She knew that since she was already remembered, and her face she should leave carefully. A moment later, everyone present saw the young lady enter the hall. They said that she was trying very hard to gain the interest of Her Highness, the Crown Princess. They were surprised and wondered if she was not on the side of the prince. Adette was shocked. She was already tired of all the rumors. A moment later, the young lady called out to her. Adette was happy to see Lady Chevy. The lady glared at her friend and asked with a smile if she had a good time at the tea party. Adette looked closely at her friend and said with a smile that she had a very good time and really liked it there. Everyone present was staring at them. The lady looked closely at her friend and said excitedly that she had heard that the dress she had chosen for her matched the dress of the crown princess. She said that she felt so ashamed when they told her about it. Adette looked closely at her friend and said that there was nothing wrong with it, since it meant that she had great taste. She said that the princess just smiled, and I didn't concentrate on it. A moment later, the young lady turned around as she saw young Master Depine El Wang. The lady was in shock and simply could not believe that the commander of the Second Knightly Order came to her family's ball. Adette, in turn, did not share such enthusiasm of her friend. Adette was shocked because as soon as the young lady saw the man, she rushed towards him. She looked at the young man in surprise as he frowned, looking in her direction. She looked around and wondered if he really looked at her so unkindly now. She was excited and did not understand why he was looking at her like that. She was furious and thought that this was just some kind of ridiculous thing. She wondered if she had done something wrong. She knew that the royal family had become noisy because of the departure to the south. She wondered if there were only 2 orders of knights left free. She was very sad and wondered if the duke was really going to fight. She knew that, for this reason, it would be difficult for them to see each other for some time. The young man came out onto the terrace. He looked at the young lady in surprise and said that he did not know that anyone was here. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if he could stay on the terrace for a while. The young lady, in turn, looked at the young man with embarrassment, since he was handsome. She smiled and said that, of course, he could stay here as she was about to leave. He looked at her intently and said that they could stay here together. Adette looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and with a friendly smile asked if there was any problem. Adette asked the young man if he was not originally from Valise. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she knew about this. He said that he thought he spoke Valise fluently. The young lady said that the department is not in the language of just single men, and women should be careful when left alone. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this was really so. He asked for forgiveness for his tactlessness. The young lady looked closely at the young man and said with a smile that everything was fine, but in turn she was puzzled, since there were already rumors about her. She smiled and asked where he came from. The young man said that he came from Laoth. The young lady stood quietly and overheard their conversation. She noticed that Adette was very obsessed with men. The young lady looked closely at the young man and said with a smile that she had read about this city in books. She smiled and said that it was an ice kingdom located at the edge of the north. He smiled and looked at the young lady and said that she seemed to know a lot. Adette said with a smile that she dreams of going there in old age. He smiled and said that he was very pleased to hear that he said that he also likes to travel. Adette looked at her companion with admiration and said that he had probably visited many countries. He smiled and said that of course it was, and also asked if she would like to hear the story of his journey. For some time, they stood on the terrace and had a casual conversation. She looked closely at her companion and asked what his impression of the kingdom of Valise was. The young man frowned and said that this country simply amazes with its art. He said there was a lot of beautiful architecture downtown, and there was amazing music and art. But a moment later, he changed his face and said that, unfortunately, the border area is completely different. The young lady looked at him in surprise. She looked at him intently and said that she heard the conflict was intensifying there. She looked at him intently and asked excitedly if he knew how serious it was. The young man frowned and said sadly that he thought the lady would not be very pleased to hear about such a thing. She said it was true, and she was a lady, but that was no reason to pretend she didn't know what was going on in the kingdom where she was born and raised. The young man sighed heavily and said that this was his personal opinion. He gazed into the distance and said that compared to other countries, the kingdom had a huge gap between rich and poor. He said with sorrow that this is especially visible in the southern border area. Since it looks like a battlefield, the young lady froze in surprise on the spot. She did not expect to hear this at all. He looked closely at everyone present in the hall and said that he was very surprised, since the royal capital was so different from the border area. He said with sorrow in his voice that it looked very alarming. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that everything was more serious than she thought. She looked at everyone present and said that they got this daily life through the exploitation of others, and it will probably continue like this forever. She said that if the lives of the inhabitants of the domain and the peasants were destroyed, the lives of the aristocrats could not be guaranteed. The young man looked at her in surprise, but a moment later he approached her and said with a smile that after all, because there are people like her, the kingdom will prosper. The young people said that the count was a very good man. He was a real nobleman who contributed to the country and sincerely cared about his domains. The lady asked Madame how much time had passed since the young master died. She was puzzled because she knew that this was an unfortunate fate. The young people looked intently at the young lady. The prince in turn wanted to know the cause of death. The duke sighed heavily and said that the reason was poisoning. The duke said that according to the countess, he had been threatened before. Cade said that the count raised an objection to the issue of conscription to the southern front. He said with sorrow in his voice that it seemed that the crown princess was involved. The prince was furious because he knew that the princess intended to send him to the south by any means. He exhaled heavily and said that she ended up trying to isolate him. The duke looked closely at his friend and said that he should not worry so much. The duke said that without the king's approval, it would not be possible to send the first order of knights outside the capital. The prince sighed heavily and said that for this reason he was worried. He knew that the crazy king was very fascinated by the young princess, and he could put a seal anywhere. The prince asked the duke if there was news about the application for an audience with the crown princess. The young man said that the king's condition had recently worsened, so audiences with him were prohibited for some time. The prince looked at those present in surprise and asked if this was so. A moment later, he said that they should continue observing. The duke looked at the prince and said that a letter had arrived from Layot. The prince was very happy since the day of the princess's arrival had already been set. He froze in surprise. The duke excitedly asked what was in the letter. The prince asked in surprise why the name of the young lady Burse was mentioned in the letter. The duke froze in place from shock and surprise. The prince thought for a moment. He said that this was very surprising and remarked that the young lady was a very useful girl. The duke looked at the prince in surprise and asked what the letter said. The prince said with a grin that Crown Prince Layot asked him a funny request. The prince said that the young lady was asked to appoint a servant and princess of Laoth. The duke was surprised and did not know how the crown prince knew about the young lady. The prince sighed heavily and thoughtfully said that he himself was interested. The most powerful heir to the throne of the kingdom of Laoth, Crown Prince Hellas Laoth, and his younger sister, Princess Laoth. She also promised to marry Prince Wishot. In order for this marriage to take place on the day of the crown princess's tea party, the prince took advantage of the crown princess's distraction and received approval for the marriage proposal from the king. He knew that all he had to do was take advantage of the young lady. But suddenly, the crown prince mentioned the young viscountess. The duke angrily said that this would not happen. The prince looked at the duke in surprise and asked what he had just said. The duke looked closely at the prince and said that it is customary for maids to be chosen from count families and above. The prince said that this was not such a big problem. Cade said that the young lady was different from the other ladies embroidering in the living room. He said that she is very different because she is responsible for her family. The duke said it would be wrong for such a lady to work as a maid. The prince looked closely at his friend, but did not answer. The duke knew that if the young lady became a maid and entered the palace, things would become even more dangerous. He knew that what happened to the count could happen again. He understood perfectly well that he had to prevent this. The duke looked closely at the prince and said in all seriousness that there are many young ladies who want to work as maids. The duke told the prince that he could choose a candidate from among them. The prince sighed heavily and called his friend. He said that even if he tried, he could not change anything. The prince looked closely at his friend and said that she was going on a fox hunt. The crown princess invited the young lady. The young man looked at everyone present with a smile and said that this year the fox hunt was special. He looked intently at everyone present and said with a smile that to ensure the safety of the noble ladies' knights would also take part in this hunt. The young ladies gazed at the knights as they looked absolutely stunning. Adette heard the admiring conversations of the young ladies, but a moment later, she noticed the Duke. The Duke in turn looked intently at the young lady. She saw that they were looking at each other. The lady looked at the Countess and said with a smile that he had just looked at her. The young Countess looked at her friends with an embarrassed smile. The young man looked at everyone present with a smile and said that for the winner of the fox hunt, the crown princess would grant a wish. He smiled and said that for this reason, they should all try their best. The young lady in turn looked sideways at the princess. Adette remembered how the princess said that if the Duke stood in the vanguard, then all the aristocrats would be calm. Adette raised her hand and asked the princess if she would grant any wish. The princess frowned at the young lady as she was furious. But a moment later, she said with a smile, young lady, that of course she would fulfill any wish. The princess said with a feigned smile that she hoped that she would have a good result. The Duke in turn looked warily at the young ladies. The young lady looked intently at the young Viscountess and asked with a smile what kind of wish she wanted to make. She said that it was useless to even try. Adette in turn knew that she absolutely had to win. Everyone looked closely at the princess and said that this year she would be the winner. A few minutes later, the horn sounded and the hunt began. The Duke looked closely at the young lady. He hoped that nothing would happen to her. The princess looked at the young lady and said that she seemed to be very popular among the gentlemen. Adette told the princess that this was not the case, as rumors were always exaggerated. The countess looked intently at the young lady and said that she would not agree with him, because recently, at a banquet of the count's family, she had a very long conversation with an aristocrat. The young lady in turn was furious because she realized that the princess's maid had seen and heard everything again. The princess looked closely at the young lady and asked if it was true. She said that the young viscountess seemed to be very popular. She was surprised since the young lady was still unmarried. Adette froze in surprise, not knowing what to answer. The princess looked at the young lady with an onion grin and asked if she really already had someone in mind from whom she was expecting courtship. The young lady froze for a moment and thought, the Duke suddenly appeared in her thoughts with a smile and a beautiful bouquet of flowers. A moment later, she told the princess that she occupied a leading position in her family. She looked at her intently and said that, unfortunately, she did not have time to think about marriage. A moment later, the princess was pointed to the place where the prey was. The princess rushed to the place with the speed of lightning. The young lady looked closely at her friend and said with a smile that she thought there were forests there. Adette looked sideways at her friend and called out to her. The young lady said she couldn't and told her friend to go ahead. Adette was very excited and puzzled. She didn't know what to do in this situation. A moment later, she saw a small fox run out of the bushes. She shouted to her friend and asked for forgiveness, since she had to catch the forest. The lady smiled and said that everything was in order, and she must definitely catch in the forest. A moment later, she rushed in the direction where the fox was running. For a moment she hesitated, because she didn't know where she had gone. She looked closer and saw the horse that had jumped off in the bushes in the forest. She reached for it as if she already knew that she had caught it. But a moment later, a young man came out of the bushes and, looking at the young lady, asked if she had really been here all this time. He said that he was looking for her. The young lady in turn froze in shock in place as she saw that the forest she so desired was running away from her. The young man looked at the young lady with rage and contempt and called her. Adette froze in place as she sensed an evil aura emanating from the young master. Adette looked closely at the young man and said that if he was not in a hurry, then they could talk another time. He did not answer her, but a moment later, he looked at the young lady with a grin and disdain and asked how her sister was doing. Adette froze in place when she heard that the conversation was about her sister. She knew that among the letters with questions about the well-being of her mother and her sister, there was also a letter from the young master. She was shocked when she sent dozens of letters to Viola. She looked closely at the young man and said that, as she had already answered before sisters are fine, She knew that a letter had come from the kingdom saying that their life was going well. He looked at her with fury and asked how she knew about this. He said that the young lady was not in their kingdom. Adette froze in horror on the spot. She was surprised she did not know how he knew about this. She was confused, and in a trembling voice asked what he was talking about. He looked at her and asked with rage, did she really think that people really don't know anything? He brought it to her with the speed of lightning. She was shocked because she understood that he was now talking about her sister's disappearance. She wondered if this had become known to everyone. He shouted that her sister was getting more attention than hers. He looked at her intently and asked if this was the reason they sent her abroad. The young lady froze in place in surprise and shock. She looked at him intently and asked where he heard about it. He shouted that the princess and the countess knew everything about it. The young lady glared at him as she now raised where such rumors originated. She looked at him intently and said that what he said earlier was not true. She said that without seeing Togo himself, he had already stated similar things. The young man shouted that it was she who was polluting the honor of the young lady Viola. The young lady froze in surprise in place. She was taken aback, and looking at the young man wondered if he had gone completely crazy. He attacked her with rage and asked if she really thought that he did not know about her plan. He shouted that there were rumors that she was comparing the prince and the duke. He shouted that she could have deceived someone else but not him. The young man shouted that he knew everything from the day she brazenly got into business. Despite the fact that she was a woman, he furiously grabbed her clothes. The young lady was very frightened. Looking at the young man, she shouted that he should calm down. He looked at her with rage and hatred and pushed her away with the speed of lightning. He shouted that she should know her place. Adette was in shock because she realized that she was falling into some kind of hole. She was flying all the time and screaming. The young man looked intently at everyone present and said with a satisfied smile that the winner of this year's fox hunt was His Highness the Crown Princess. The princess in turn looked at everyone present with a satisfied smile and thanked them. She looked at everyone with a smile and said that dinner was ready, and she also asked if they would like to join. The young lady in turn carefully examined the surroundings in search of her friend. The Duke noticed her alarmed face. He slowly walked up to the young lady and called her. He looked at her intently and asked if she was not with the young lady Burst today. She sighed heavily and said that she was with her, but after she left her during the hunt, she never returned Herzen's in place from shock and surprise. A moment later, the Duke turned his gaze into the distance and saw a pleased knight walking with a grin on his face. Watching the captain of the knights, he noticed that he went to the princess. He said something to the princess, and she looked at him with a satisfied grin. The Duke was furious as he realized that they were involved in something that the young lady was not having now. A moment later, he remembered what happened to the Count recently. With the speed of lightning, he turned around and rushed in search of the young lady. The Countess slowly approached the Duke and excitedly called him. He turned around in bewilderment, so he did not understand who was calling him. The Countess looked at him intently and embarrassedly said that he should not go. The Duke looked at the young lady with bewilderment and, asking for forgiveness, asked who she was. The Countess was shocked since he did not know her. She said that she was a servant of Her Highness the Crown Princess. She looked at him intently and introduced herself. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and said that he understood her. He asked if she had happened to see the young lady Adette. She was shocked because now she realized that without even knowing her, he was calling her whining lady by name. She sighed heavily and said that she had not seen her. The Duke looked at him intently and said that he understood. She sighed heavily and nervously said that he could not go in search of the young Viscountess. After all, he had come today to guard Her Highness. The Duke looked at her intently and said that she was completely right. However, protecting the other ladies was also his duty. He looked at the young lady with fury and said that if something happened here, he must definitely find the culprit. She froze in surprise as his aura pressed on her. Sitting in the hole, the young lady called for help, but it was all in vain. She was furious because she realized that it seemed like no one was around. She knew that a lot of time had passed, and most likely everyone had already left. She was furious and cursed the young master. She knew that, although he was a vile person, He would not do such a thing alone. She was furious because she understood that someone had definitely put him up to it. She even guessed who it was, but she was still at a loss because she didn't understand why they did it. Adette did not understand how they would benefit from spreading such a rumor. She thought for a moment about what the young man said. Then he said that she was comparing the prince and the duke. She didn't understand what was wrong with that. Even if she was actually doing it, she knew that the prince wouldn't give her anything for nothing needed. She was a little worried because she understood that lately she had not been able to talk normally with the duke. She was furious and did not understand why no one could leave her alone. The young lady was shocked, wondering what she had done wrong. She screamed with rage that she didn't even want to get married. She screamed that if things continued like this, she would just remain stuck. She screamed that if she was going to suffer a miserable death because of unexplained charges. That is all, whether she dies now or not. She was furious and screamed that now she will do what she wants. A moment later, she froze in place as she heard some noise in the distance.